This morning, the committee welcomes Commissioner Werfel back to the Senate to discuss the IRS budget in this filing season, which of course came to a close yesterday. Let me begin by thanking the staff at the IRS for the hard work that made this the smoothest filing season in many years. Democrats made a big investment in taxpayer service with the Inflation Reduction Act, and it goes without saying that now the American people have a right to know what they got with that investment. The numbers paint a clear picture. Last year, the IRS was able to answer 15% of the phone calls it got. This year, it was 87%. The IRS answered 2 million more calls and helped 100,000 more taxpayers in person. The return backlog is now way down. The technology upgrades are helping to get the refunds out the door more quickly. So these are real, concrete improvements. Now, looking ahead, at the top of our agenda needs to be reducing the tax gap. This is money that's owed to American taxpayers and just hasn't been collected. The official estimate says that $540 billion of taxes owed go unpaid every year. Other estimates, including from Donald Trump's IRS commissioner, believe that it could be $1 trillion. These estimates are so far apart because sophisticated, wealthy tax cheats excel at hiding in the shadows. The IRS can't measure the law breaking because it doesn't have all the resources to identify it in the first place. So the bottom line is pretty clear. You cannot get at the tax gap without focusing on these wealthy tax cheats and highly complicated businesses like large partnerships. That's what Democrats have sought to accomplish with the tax enforcement funding in the Inflation Reduction Act. The IRS plan for that funding came out a few weeks ago. I'm sure members have a lot to say about it. It is clear to me that the IRS is focusing on the key issues that the law has subscribed to. The reality is there are big challenges for the Congress to address: shoring up Medicare and Social Security, child care and education for families, paid leave for workers. Both sides have made it clear they want to address the country's fiscal health. Reducing the tax gap helps create the headroom to be able to address those issues. If the first priority is making it harder for wealthy tax cheats to get away with breaking the law, the next priority ought to be to make this tax season filing easier for everybody else. I think we all have heard from our constituents the last few weeks continued stories about how complicated it is, how much time it takes, how many forms. Why is all of this bureaucracy necessary? Now, the Inflation Reduction Act took an important step on an alternative. It's called free direct filing. It would provide another option for taxpayers. And colleagues, it is voluntary. It is something they can choose to have. A voluntary option when they're sick of the hassle and expense that comes with filing online today. There's a study underway looking at how to go about building such a system. Republicans and the tax prep lobby in the past have reacted as if this is just going to be pretty much the end of Western civilization. There used to be bipartisan interest in building a free file system that saved taxpayers and money each year. Making it easier to file was a key component, for example, of the bipartisan tax reform proposal that I wrote with Senator Dan Coates a little more than a decade ago. The seat was right down there. We put together a bipartisan tax reform proposal that included a simplified system should middle-class folks want to choose it. And I am always, colleagues, going to hope that one day we can have another bipartisan proposal to include free file the kind of idea Senator Coates and I pursued for so many years. Unfortunately, these days, too many Republicans are on the side of the big tax prep companies, the big companies that squeeze Americans for billions of dollars each year in various fees and markups. They've even objected to the organization that's conducting the free file study. I'm sure these legislators would prefer to have the tax prep lobby in charge of studying the issue to smother it from the get-go. It's always been the same pattern. Each time free file came up, an army of well-paid lawyers and lobbyists descends on Congress to squash it. And too many Republicans stand there, right there with them. This must not be allowed to happen again. Democrats are committed to the proposition that it shouldn't cost hundreds of dollars and many more hours of time simply to follow the law, and to pay what you owe. When it comes to filing taxes online, the status quo is unacceptable. So these are some of the agenda items that Democrats are focused on, including reducing the tax gap by going after cheating, by wealthy scofflaws, and making tax filing easier for everybody else. Those are our priorities. Here's some of the things we're seeing from the other side. When they talk about fiscal health, they're talking about giving billionaires a free pass to cheat on their taxes. It's in the proposals. The billionaires get a free pass. Speaker McCarthy works overtime to rally Republicans around a plan that would gut health care and increase hunger among tens of millions of Americans. Apparently, if he doesn't get what he wants, he is willing to let this country go through a catastrophic default. And that is the operative word here, folks, default. There's a lot of lingo about debt ceilings and all these kinds of things. What's really at issue is whether this country is going to get clobbered by a default. The Congress ought to take a smarter approach. That includes making sure the IRS can meet the needs of the American people and enforce the law when billionaires skip out on paying what they owe. So there's plenty to talk about today. I want to thank Commissioner Werfel for joining us again. And as always, Senator Crapo and I try to find as much common ground as we can on these issues. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Werfel, thank you for testifying this morning and as well for your conduct in these first few weeks of your tenure. I hope you'll continue to be transparent, accessible, and willing to work with me and my colleagues, particularly regarding support for taxpayer services and modernization of our outdated IT, which House Republicans passed in their bill showing their support. While not the focus of today's hearing, the IRS's recent 150-page response to Secretary Yellen's directive to deliver to her a 10-year operational plan for spending its Inflation Reduction Act funding requires comment. Secretary Yellen promised a plan that would allow the public and Congress to hold the IRS accountable for the project. While dense, what has been delivered is noticeably light on many essential attributes of a plan and will be extremely challenging to use to document and as a document to hold the IRS, the Treasury Department, or anybody else accountable for missteps. A few things it almost entirely lacks include quantitative targets to measure against, backup data to analyze, and various key operational details, including, for example, who at the IRS or Treasury Department is ultimately responsible for making decisions on any particular issue. It does not give any detail on how the IRS will implement Secretary Yellen's $400,000 pledge, and details really matter here. It also does not estimate what any of the 42 initiatives or 190-odd key projects are expected to cost, or clearly answer the basic question of which initiatives or key projects can be fully implemented with the $80 billion in funding. What the document quietly admits is astonishing. Despite contrary rhetoric, the IRA did not give the IRS enough funding to fully realize the plan's vision. This, despite having given the agency a slug of funding more than 6 times its annual budget. The IRS's annual budget justification goes further, asking for 15% increases in the IRS's discretionary appropriations to make up in the short term for areas where the IRA funding falls short, particularly in taxpayer services and IT modernization. The IRS's annual budget justification also warns that if Congress fails to increase future IRS discretionary budgets on top of the $80 billion, and in particular spend even more for taxpayer services and IT modernization, the IRS's future service delivery will actually suffer. Finally, the President's budget requests still more IRS funding for future enforcement efforts, $29.1 billion more. That's on top of the $80 billion. Americans rightly have a hard time understanding how an agency provided more than 6 times its annual funding can still claim poverty. And given that the plan the IRS delivered is not transparent and does not allow for any meaningful accountability, this plea is essentially for another blank check. I've heard some argue that future uncertainty prevents the IRS from making firm estimates beyond a fiscal year or two. Indeed, that sounds like a tacit admission that circumventing the annual appropriations process for the $80 billion was a huge spend first, planned later mistake. But this uncertainty excuse falls completely flat when one observes the countless other examples of long-term budget, revenue, and cost eliminating, both in the public and private sectors. When you last testified before us, you promised to regularly update the IRS's spending plan and solicit this committee's feedback. Based upon what has just been delivered, I strongly suggest you accelerate your timeline and return to this committee in short order with an actual plan. Returning to the subject of this hearing, my colleagues and I eagerly await discussing the IRS's annual discretionary budget request and current performance measures. I've learned more in the last few weeks about the sometimes puzzling ways the IRS measures its own effectiveness, such as on answering phones. What I have learned would be more troubling if not for the hope that you will adhere to your promise to enhance the rigor and meaningfulness of the IRS's data collection and analysis. I recognize that you are only a few weeks into your tenure and are already facing momentous decisions that will likely have lasting consequences. I was encouraged by your commitments, which include full and prompt transparency, utilizing best management practices, making decisions based on sound and unbiased data, ensuring the IRS is strictly nonpartisan, not making any policy decisions that are Congress's responsibility, and turning to Congress at every possible opportunity for guidance and authorization. How well you adhere to these promises will determine the legacy you leave the IRS and the American taxpayers with, as well as your relationship with Congress. I urge you to walk the straight course and set a positive trajectory, and above all, keep the IRS out of the partisan gamesmanship. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank my colleague, and as my colleagues all know, we will have further briefings this week on the strategic operating plan by Mr. Werfel, so we appreciate that. Our witness today is Daniel Werfel, 50th Commissioner of the IRS. He previously was a managing partner at the Boston Consulting Group. Before joining Boston Consulting, he was nominated to be Controller at the Office of Management and Budget, where he served for 4 years before becoming acting Commissioner of the IRS in 2013. Began his career at OMB in 1997. We welcome him. Why don't you go ahead, Mr. Werfel, and we'll have questions.
Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the filing season and the IRS budget. I am pleased to report the IRS provided substantially better service to taxpayers during the 2023 filing season. We delivered a strong tax season for the nation, the best in several years. Through April 7th, the IRS received more than 101 million individual federal returns and issued more than 69 million refunds, totaling about $199 billion. IRS employees were able to make substantial improvements this tax season because of the funding Congress provided through the Inflation Reduction Act. This funding made a difference. It allowed us to hire more than 5,000 phone assisters, which led to a phone-level service averaging 87% during the filing season. The average wait time on the phones was 4 minutes. This is a major improvement from last year, when service levels were under 15% and wait times averaged 27 minutes. Perhaps most telling was this: IRS employees answered 6.5 million calls to help taxpayers. That's 2.5 million more calls than last year. Improvements were seen in other areas. We increased face-to-face visits at our taxpayer assistance centers to 474,000. That's up more than 30% from the year before. And we expanded digital scanning efforts to speed up the processing of paper returns. Providing a better filing season experience this year was an important step, but more work remains. The long-term funding from the Inflation Reduction Act gives us a unique opportunity to transform our agency over the next decade. Historically, the IRS received funding that allowed our staffing and operations to keep pace with the size of the U.S. population. In 2010, that changed. Cuts in annual funding caused IRS staffing levels to decline by nearly 17% to less than 80,000 full-time employees by 2022. While the IRS shrank, the U.S. population grew by more than 7%, reaching 334 million. These reductions caught up with us. You could see that in the poor taxpayer service levels in previous years, including last year. We were able to improve this filing season by shifting Inflation Reduction Act funds over to our day-to-day operations. If we continue using Inflation Reduction Act funding this way, however, focused on short-term operations rather than long-term systemic improvements, we will not be able to transform the taxpayer experience, modernize outdated IRS technology, and deliver more effective enforcement of the tax laws as the Inflation Reduction Act envisions. The IRA funding was designed to restore IRS core operations and prepare the agency to serve the nation in its future. But that work is outside of our base level funding. That level of funding, which is $12.3 billion for fiscal year 2023, has not materially increased since fiscal year 2010. In fact, in real terms, we are 33% below our funding level in fiscal year 2010 if we had just received inflationary adjustments. It's not enough resources to fund a tax system in an economy that grows in size and complexity every year. So I ask for your help to build on the remarkable progress we saw this filing season by supporting the $1.8 billion in incremental discretionary funding requested for fiscal year 2024. This funding will enable us to maintain our current performance in the next filing season, while allowing us to use the Inflation Reduction Act resources as Congress intended, to modernize our operations so we can sustain and improve our service to taxpayers into the future. Our strategic operating plan lays out in detail our path forward, describing how we will improve all aspects of our operations. The plan, which I call our public to-do list, lays out roughly 200 projects for improvements for taxpayers, tax professionals, and IRS employees that will transform our work on the phones, in person, and online. Inflation Reduction Act funding also gives us an important opportunity to improve enforcement efforts to promote fairness while respecting taxpayer rights. The agency will follow Secretary Yellen's directive not to raise audit rates above historical levels for small businesses and households making less than $400,000. I want to be crystal clear. We are not increasing audit rates for hard-working taxpayers making under $400,000. That is my pledge. There is no surge of new audits coming for workers, retirees, and others. We have plenty of other areas we need to focus on. Instead, we will build capacity to pursue high-income and high-wealth individuals, complex partnerships, and large corporations that are not paying the taxes they owe. we will use Inflation Reduction Act resources to hire highly skilled employees to address noncompliance among this group of taxpayers. I plan to provide regular updates to Congress and the public on our efforts to transform the IRS, and I would be happy to delve deeper into the details with committee members. For example, I will provide a supplemental document that provides in one place extensive detail on planned expenditures over a 10-year period and on hiring over a 3-year period. And within the next 3 to 6 weeks, I will be able to add more detail showing expected hiring across the full 10-year window. I am optimistic we can build on the accomplishments of this filing season. The question is not whether the IRS can improve service to taxpayers. This year, we proved that dramatic improvement is possible. The question is whether we can continue to improve. I am confident that we continue this trajectory if we have adequate annual funding for day-to-day operations coupled with the long-term resources. Combined, these will transform the IRS over the long term into an agency that taxpayers and the nation expect and deserve. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, that concludes my statement. I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Werfel. We know in this country we have a tax gap of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. This is money owed to the American taxpayer but not collected. Your predecessor sat where you are this morning not very long ago and said the tax gap may be as high as $1 trillion a year. And he also said you're not going to be able to collect those monies, deal with the tax gap, unless you go after the very wealthy tax cheats. And that's because, and you've mentioned this, the workers who have wages and salaries, we already know essentially a lot about them with respect to the taxes owed. It's these wealthy tax cheats who can pretty much decide what they want to pay, when they want to pay it, that are the challenge. So my question is, a couple of weeks ago, the Senate Finance Committee completed a long investigation finding that the big bank, Credit Suisse, violated a plea deal with the Department of Justice where, again, you are seeing massive tax evasion by thousands of wealthy Americans. Our investigations team uncovered an ongoing conspiracy, in one instance involving a single family, failure to disclose $100 million in secret offshore accounts. If that wasn't bad enough, the investigation found that Credit Suisse in total concealed from U.S. authorities 23 large accounts worth more than $700 million. And this kind of flagrant abuse, flagrant tax evasion, highlights the point that you and I have been talking about, is that this ballgame is all about going after these wealthy tax cheats. So my question to you is, Commissioner, how will the agency, the IRS, use the funding you've got to step up enforcement to crack down, for example, on the use of secret offshore accounts, something that is ongoing by wealthy Americans? How are you going to use the funds to tackle that?
Well, as I've said, Mr. Chairman, the enforcement funds in the Inflation Reduction Act will be focused to improve capacity in these areas of reviewing the taxes of high wealth individuals, large corporations, and complex partnerships. It's been a place that we have been historically severely under-resourced to take on, and the Inflation Reduction Act provides much-needed resources for us to finally build the capacities that we haven't had. Now, your point, critical to doing this, is we have to ID certain patterns of activity where tax dodging is most rampant. And you point out, offshore. You're not the only one to point this out. In a recent GAO report on the tax gap, they ID'd abusive tax shelters as an area where the IRS has to do more. So our plan is to build capacity, and that means subject matter experts, specialized accountants, data scientists, lawyers, all of which who understand how these things are set up and can help us navigate them and figure out where the funds are that should have been paid back to the nation that haven't been.
So you will go after foreign banks like Credit Suisse. And the reason I want to ask that question first is Credit Suisse got busted almost a decade ago for doing what we found they have continued to do. In other words, they came to the federal government, their CEO raised his right hand, promised 100% compliance. And then all of a sudden, what we found is we're dealing with it all over again. So you've got recidivists here, people who have ripped off the American taxpayer, because it's those working class people that pay when the wealthy Americans get out of their obligations. And I think it is very important that the American people hear that when you're talking about a recidivist like Credit Suisse, who promised that they would stop doing it and then continued to do it, I think it's important that we know those are the kind of people that you're going to go after.
Mr. Chairman, I'm prohibited from discussing any individual taxpayer in a public setting.
I'm talking about the kind of action that I believe needs to be a priority. You don't need to go into specific names.
And I was going to say, lifting up, absolutely the goal is to understand these patterns of behavior across these very complicated organizations. Because they're so complicated, large multinational corporations, complex partnerships, they have many divisions and subdivisions, they're operating across different countries, they have different financial structures. It's a lot to unpack.
My time has expired, and your last point, Commissioner, is very much on point, where you said the patterns are what is important. Credit Suisse, the pattern was all there. Huge violations, enter an agreement with the government, and then basically after a little bit of time goes by, they do exactly the same thing. So when you talk about patterns, it's exactly the kind of issue that Credit Suisse presented, because after they made all these grandiose promises in 2014, they just went back to ripping off American taxpayers. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Director Werfel, I want to start out with an issue which my colleague Senator Wyden raised in his introductory remarks, where we do have a big disagreement, namely whether the IRS should be the entity that prepares people's taxes for them. Some want the IRS to prepare tax returns for taxpayers, and several colleagues have actually introduced legislation in Congress to authorize the IRS to do that. The IRA gave the IRS $15 million to study such an outcome. That idea is concerning, and not just because of the apparent bias in favor of doing so by those who were selected to conduct this study, but for a lot of other reasons. Having the IRS act as tax preparer, tax collector, and tax enforcer raises significant conflicts of interest in many of our minds. It would incur billions of dollars of cost and development, and would expose exponentially more taxpayer information to misuse or abuse. The private industry, the private sector of this country already prepares and files free tax returns for tens of millions of Americans. And millions more of Americans are already eligible for that. The IRS's strategic plan has an entire initiative devoted to an IRS-run tax preparation program, which seems to me odd because it's still being studied right now. And the question I have for you is, has the IRS made the determination that it is going to pursue this? And if so, where does the IRS find its statutory authorization to do so, or the funding allocated and appropriated to do so?
Senator, no decision has been made on moving forward with a direct file solution, and in large measure because of the point you raised. The Inflation Reduction Act mandated that the IRS produce a study for this committee and for Congress on the feasibility of such a solution. That study is due in mid-May. We're on track to complete that study. I don't want to jump ahead of the conclusion because the study's not done yet. And so we're still working through. And what we plan to produce will hopefully create an important dialogue between the IRS, the administration, and this committee on what the study says and whether it is feasible or not and what the various issues are. Because you've raised some questions, and hopefully the study will help us have a good dialogue on those questions.
Well, can we agree that, I'm glad to hear your answer, that it's not a predetermined outcome already. And can we agree that the decision is one that Congress can make, not the IRS independently?
I'm not sure of where the legal authorities are. I think it's a good question to ask in the context of issuing the report. The report really focuses on operationally what it would take to produce such a solution. Your question in terms of who has the legal authority is something I'm not sure is within the scope of the report, but is clearly an important question to ask on any go-forward plan.
Well, I would tell you that I encourage you to recognize that Congress has the authority to make this determination. Let me move on. My time is running out. Senator Wyden also asked you about the tax gap. Have you done an analysis, or has the IRS done any kind of an in-depth analysis you can show us as to where the tax gap lies? And what I'm referring to is something like what we've seen out of the Joint Tax Committee that goes by income increment or cohort. Where is the tax gap? That whether we can decide on what the amount of that tax gap is, where is the tax gap among people who live in the United States or who are taxpayers?
Yeah, we released our latest tax gap assessment in October of 2022. It covers years 2014 to 16. I don't think we have time to unpack all of the rich content in there. I will say that it does give us a good roadmap for where to assess where there's a difference between the balance owed and the balance paid. One of the things that's important to understand is we're constantly trying to improve the way we measure the tax gap. And when I was answering Chairman Wyden's question, when we have better capacity to assess, for example, high-income taxpayers, individuals, large corporations, and complex partnerships, we will learn more about how those financial structures are laid out and be able to hone more detail in terms of what the tax gap is in those areas.
Well, thank you. And my time's running out. I want to ask my last question.
Please.
So I was very interested in your, again, making the pledge that you will not increase taxes on those audits on those making less than $400,000. As you've likely gathered from my opening statement, I'm concerned that the strategic plan did nothing to flesh out the details of this. And I don't have time for you to get into it today, but we know even less about what the IRS believes will happen to actual audit numbers for taxpayers making less than $400,000 than we did before. There is some kind of a historical rate that's being referenced. There is a pledge now, and a pledge from both Secretary Yellen and you, but we need to get details as to exactly how this pledge will be honored as we move forward.
Yes, sir. I'm prepared to provide additional details, maybe in additional questions that are coming up. I know we have a member meeting with me tomorrow. Of course, I understand that there's a request for more details, and I think the plan that was issued is robust. As you said, it's dense. Does it answer every question? No, and that's because we want to work with you to figure out what the questions are that we need to answer to make sure that what we're doing is very clear in terms of how we're going to improve the IRS.
Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Werfel, thank you for being here, and congratulations on this tax season. You have triaged the IRS in order to deal with the necessary services to taxpayers, and you've done it well. And I appreciate the point that you make, and that is you need to have the ability now to invest for the future in regards to technology and workforce so that you can maintain that type of service level. One of my highest priorities for the IRS is to recognize it needs to be a customer-based organization. You need to be able to answer questions of taxpayers. You need to be able to provide those services. So I thank you for giving us the hope that we can, in fact, do that in a more acceptable way. I want to first acknowledge that our chairman and ranking member have been very sensitive to the concerns of small businesses. I chair the Small Business Committee, and we're going to have some joint efforts between this committee and the Small Business Committee to deal with the challenges that small businesses are confronting in regards to our tax code. As you know, small businesses depend very much on the IRS improving its customer services and improving its technology. So it will help the investments you're talking about making. But small businesses do not have the same type of tax literacy that larger companies have. And they certainly don't have the personnel to deal with complexities in the tax code related to their business if they only have 1 or 2 employees and they're trying to struggle with the challenges of a young, new entrepreneur. So I appreciate the discussion you had with the ranking member and the chairman in regards to direct filing and the study that's being done. I would encourage you to also include small businesses as to the impact it could have on our small business population on trying to simplify the way that they can comply with our tax codes. I just point out that the authority issue is interesting because we haven't given you the authority you need to go after paid providers. And one of the issues, particularly for low-income families, yes, there is free tax service available, but there are also paid providers that they're paying for, and we're not sure they're getting value in all these circumstances. And unfortunately, we don't have the accountability that is necessary here. So I hope that your advice to us will be comprehensive, particularly how we can deal with low-income families and small companies in getting through our tax code more efficiently. And then lastly, we urge you to give us areas that you believe the tax code needs to be modified as it relates to small companies. Because again, small companies are using the individual tax returns to deal with their taxes, and it's not as convenient as the corporate tax system is generally for larger companies, and we need your help in making that a reality. So just give me a brief reply, if you might, as to sensitivity in the work that you're doing right now to help smaller businesses deal with our tax code.
Thank you, Senator Cardin. I want to start out by just acknowledging that the point about the filing season that we've had, all the credit goes to the IRS workforce. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to be here and talk about it and talk about their success, but that's just a remarkable group of employees that care so much and are so dedicated to this mission that we have, this critical mission.
And please extend our appreciation. We recognize that. This is a stressful period for everyone, but particularly the IRS workers that are dedicated, that have stuck with the mission, recognizing the importance of public service. I agree with you.
And I think the ranking member made reference to the plan as being dense, and it is, and I want to lift up, what are the 3 main things that we're trying to achieve with the plan? And I think in doing so, I'll get to your question about small businesses. First, we want to build capacity to do better customer service. That's the first thing. The second thing is we want to build capacity to ensure that wealthy and very wealthy pay what they owe. That's individual, large corporation, complex partnerships. And third, we need to modernize the IRS infrastructure so we can better protect data and we can better automate our processes. So in all of the planning, those are the 3 things that I want taxpayers to take away. So if you're a small business, based on what I just read and what I'm committing to, that our focus for you is improved service. It's not improved, it's not some wave of audits, it's improved service. And how do we improve service for small businesses? We have to meet them where they are. We have to help them understand their obligations under the tax law. We have to figure out how to put new solutions online for them to make their journey easier. If they're paper filers, we have to figure out is there a bridge to get them to electronic files? Can we work to process their paper filers more quickly so they can get their refunds and have tax certainty more clearly? So if we can modernize the IRS, then we can also keep pace with how complex the law is and is changing, and we can meet taxpayers where they are more effectively. We just historically haven't been able to do that because of the incremental and aggressive funding cuts that have happened since 2010. But the Inflation Reduction Act provides us an opportunity. And again, if you're a small business, our emphasis, our focus, what I'm going to go to sleep at night thinking about and wake up in the morning thinking about is how do we help small businesses meet their obligation?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My colleague, Senator Cornyn's next.
Commissioner, isn't it true that a tax credit or a tax subsidy, dollar for dollar, adds to federal expenditures, and in the case of a $31 trillion debt, it adds to the debt? In other words, tax credits are just another way for the federal government to spend money, correct?
I think technically it's like an outlay or a spend with respect to measuring the deficit.
Thanks, Bill.
We talked a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act. In addition to throwing gasoline on the fire of inflation with $700 billion of additional spending and added to the debt, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, this partisan bill, this was voted on exclusively by our friends on the Democratic side of the aisle, signed into law by the President. It lavishes rich subsidies for electric vehicles, up to $7,500 tax credit for the for electric vehicles. And I want to point out that contrary to the original estimate about how much this would actually cost in terms of outlays, it was originally advertised as being a $30 billion expenditure, and the truth is it looks like it's going to be closer to $200 billion, 6.5 times higher than advertised. The President, as you know, has said by 2032 he wants to, by his magic wand, say that 2/3 of all the vehicles being built will be electric vehicles, even though we now have 280 million cars on the road, and almost all, except 2 or 3 or 4%, are internal combustion engines. Added to that, we know that about 60% of electricity that would be needed to charge those batteries comes from fossil fuels. Only about 22% of electricity is generated by renewables. And we know that basically this mandate and this expenditure, this lavish expenditure for the rich, would do virtually nothing to reduce carbon emissions. But I want to ask you about the supply chain. 77% of the batteries made in the world are made by China. We know they're on a path to increase their capacity to build electric batteries by 7-fold by 2027. Is there any way that this mandate President Biden has ordered with the stroke of his pen, is there any way that it will do anything except increase the sale of Chinese-made batteries here in the United States?
Senator, I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that what the IRS responsibilities are to issue regulations and guidance for how these credits will be evaluated and who will be eligible for them based on a very intricate array of requirements that are in place. What we are doing now is issuing on a path to issue regulations for comment. And so the questions that you're raising, the tensions, the policy tensions that you're raising will be fleshed out in the comments that we receive on the regulations. And then I will be able to come back and sit in this chair and be more illuminating in terms of what those comments are and talk to you about what those tensions are. And
you will agree with me that those regulations are going to have to be consistent with what is in the law?
Absolutely.
Okay. And actually, the Inflation Reduction Act, misnamed, I might add, actually provides a smorgasbord of credits for electric vehicles. For example, there's a $4,000 credit for used electric vehicles. That's Section 25E. There's a $40,000 tax credit for commercial electric vehicles. That's Section 45W. Yep. And then there's a tax credit for fuel cell cars, which is Section 30B. Do you know if these other credits have the same critical mineral and battery sourcing requirements as the $7,500 EV credit?
Senator, I don't know that at my fingertips, but I can certainly provide you information on that.
I appreciate that, because it appears to me that the American taxpayer will be subsidizing the purchase of Chinese-made commercial and used electric vehicles by virtue of these tax credits. So we'd appreciate your getting back to us with that information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. We're going to go to Senator Johnson, but I just want to say, as the lead author of this package of more than $200 billion in clean energy tax credits, we felt very strongly about the point Senator Cornyn's talking about batteries being made in China. And the legislation, and this was at my direction, provides incentives for batteries made in the United States. And it was something we worked on for some time.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just respond briefly, it's not possible to meet that requirement due to this constraint on supply chain and battery manufacturing. So it's either going to subsidize Chinese-made batteries or it's an illusory promise.
Plenty of supply chain issues. The fact is, and I'm going to go to Senator Johnson, the point, and it's something I happen to agree with about batteries being made in China, was something that we took direct action to deal with when we were marking up that legislation. We want batteries made in the United States. We pushed to make that possible with the incentives. Senator Johnson. Excuse me, Senator.
Yeah, I didn't think I was.
I said to my
I appreciate
colleague,
it, but I realize that.
I'm sorry for getting out of order. Senator Thune
right.
is next.
My apologies. I know how you love that, right, Senator, when people come in. Commissioner Werfel, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I know you're probably answering a lot of questions on this front, but in confirmation hearing, you said that you'd have dual priorities at the IRS, and I quote, equally focused on improving taxpayer services and improving the IRS's capacity to unpack complex returns, end quote. Now, and I appreciate and respect your aspirations there, but the funding priorities in the Inflation Reduction Act and the President's budget show very different priorities. For example, of the $80 billion provided to the IRS and the partisan IRA, more than half, or about $46 billion, is directed toward enforcement activities, but only 4% of the $80 billion, and I get 4%, was earmarked for improving taxpayer services. And President Biden recently proposed boosting the IRS budget by 15% over and above the massive funding increase the IRS received from the Inflation Reduction Act. The President's budget would provide a separate additional $29 billion to the IRS for enforcement, again, in addition to the $46 billion for enforcement the IRS received last August. So given the overwhelmingly disproportionate funding toward enforcement compared to taxpayer services, would you agree that some of the IRA enforcement funds could be more effectively spent on improving customer service?
That's a good question, Senator. I think that we actually need funds to do both, and I worry that if we were to redirect funds out of one bucket into another, we would lose important ground that we need to cover in one particular area. And I say that, I know it seems like for the enforcement dollars that there's a lot. The reality is that today we have 2,600 staff that work on high-income, high-wealth taxpayers, individuals, corporations, and complex partnerships. There are more than 390,000 of those. So, and 390,000 high-wealth, high-income taxpayers, corporations, individuals, and partnerships, and we have 2,600 staff. And a lot of these filings are thousands of pages, tens of thousands of pages, and some come in hundreds of thousands of pages. So every dollar we move off of our efforts to build the capacity to unpack those returns means I think we're leaving money on the table for the American people in terms of our ability to close the gap in terms of what's paid versus what's owed.
Well, and I don't dispute the fact that there probably could be some need for additional enforcement. It just seems like the way this skews, you think about 4% for taxpayer services. You had, 90% of the phone calls into the IRS weren't answered in 2021, and I think it was a little better last year. And then you've got this, massive amount of funding infused into the enforcement, not only out of the IRA, but now also out of the the budget, the present budget, which we're considering and talking about here today. But I want to make one other point, and I think it maybe was touched on just by Senator Cornyn. But the Inflation Reduction Act, only 4%, $3.2 billion over the overall funds toward taxpayer service. The IRS Inflation Reduction Act Strategic Operating Plan, which was recently released, more than 45 days late, I might add, proposes a total of $3.9 billion for energy security, which includes $1.2 billion of the total allotment for taxpayer services. Now, by energy security, is the IRS referring to an all of the above energy approach, including conventional energy production, or simply provisions related to green energy?
The funds that we need are to implement the energy credits. It's a lot of work. There's a lot of customer service reps that we need. So, for example, in the budget for 2024, we've asked for a $1.8 billion incremental increase. Part of that $1.8 billion is to fund about 1,200 new customer service agents and staff to help us implement the energy credits, because we're going to get a lot of questions coming in, and there's going to be a lot, and we're going to have to process additional applications for credit. So that's what that funding is talking about.
So, but as IRS Commissioner, what is a higher priority for your delivering better taxpayer services? Or is it advancing new Green Deal policies, which I will note are projected to blow past, way past initial CBO projections? I mean, is it taxpayer service or is it Green New Deal priorities?
It's taxpayer service, and the reason is because
Well, why doesn't the budget reflect that?
The IRS's responsibility is to administer the law that's enacted by Congress, and so we don't take policy preferences. We basically try to manage the portfolio.
I know you don't do that, but you do have to prioritize. You have a certain amount of allocated resources.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying, when 4% is going to taxpayer services, with the deplorable record the IRS has in responding to people across this country, and I'm all for secure and sustainable energy policies, but I am deeply concerned that the IRS has made more IRA funds committed to promoting the administration's radical energy agenda than for improving taxpayer services. And I know my time's expired. I'm working with Senator Grassley on an IRS Funding Accountability Act, which hopefully will bring some transparency and accountability to this massive infusion of dollars and resources and employees the IRS now has. And I just really urge you to reconsider your priorities.
Senator Thune, just very quickly, and then we'll go next to Senator Warner. On this question that you started with respect to service and enforcement, and you and I have worked on so many of these tax issues over the years, I would just hope that we would not say these are mutually exclusive. We ought to do both. We desperately need to improve services. Our citizens are telling us that's important, but we also need enforcement, because that's what the tax gap is all about. If we don't enforce the tax gap, we won't get the money from these wealthy people. But I'll look forward to the kind of proposals that you're going to be making, and always willing to work with you. Senator Warner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. Commissioner, it's good to see you. You don't look that much worse for the wear. Again, I think many of us on both sides of the aisle, regardless of where we may disagree or agree with specific policies, are really grateful for your willingness to take on this job. And I know the chairman's already mentioned this, but I want to commend the fact that we are working through that backlog, and we're going to have I think, an efficient, hopefully, tax-paying season. I want to drill down on two issues, one which I've raised with you already, and one that I have not. The first is, and this was the call we had in late March, the employee retention tax credit. One of the things we put in place during COVID, again, a bipartisan piece of that legislation, which I think was well-intended to make sure that folks, that employers kept people on during COVID rather than having to put them on unemployment. As I shared with you, there are a number of businesses in Virginia, and I imagine this is probably the case in other states as well, where there's been a backlog, they can't get clarity, they're not getting these tax credits, which I think they deserve. And since these are businesses that did, from a policy standpoint, what I think we all thought was the right thing by keeping folks employed during that period, can you update us on the overall ERC backlog and where we stand?
I can, Senator. Thank you for the question. And what I'd like to do is just very quickly walk you through the situation as I'm finding it in my first weeks at the IRS, the actions that we're taking and the results that I expect or we should expect. So the situation is the employee retention credit is an extremely complicated filing to process. It's paper-based. It's often coming through as an amended return, and you have to align resources across multiple tax years. So the staff at the IRS has a lot of work to do when these come in to make sure they're processed correctly. Secondly, we see a lot of potential fraud and issues in terms of, nefarious individuals seeking these refunds when they're not, or these credits when they're not eligible, or trying to dupe people into thinking that they are eligible and they're not. So that also clutters. So that's the situation. The action is that now that filing season has ended, we now expect less calls coming in as people have, most of them have filed their taxes. We can redeploy people off the phones and reset so that we're managing paper. Now, prior to this move of moving people off the phones, we were resolving about 20,000 of these employee retention credits a week, using overtime and any downtime where the phones aren't up, moving people to do it. Like every resource, it's an all-hands-on-deck situation. Post this filing season, now that we can reset the staff, I think we can maybe double per week the amount of refund of credits that we're processing. So that's the action that we're taking. And in particular, I want to make sure, and I've talked to the team about making sure that we go with the older ones first, like those that have been waiting the longest. So, really focus on if it was received in 2022 or prior, because they're still coming in. And under the law, they can come in until 2025. So this is a filing that we're going to be dealing with for years, but I think we're going to make progress.
How many, but if you're saying, it's a great answer, but I also took away the fact that you're going to double per week the number of these that are dealt. How many are being, how much of the backlog is being taken care of on a weekly basis at this point?
20K.
20K. So
20K a week.
we can look at 40K a week going
That's
forward?
the hope.
Okay.
That's what I've asked the team
You
to
just
do.
said it on the record, so I'm going to be back to you. Last question. Section 127 of the code has something that has, again, been bipartisan supported for years, which basically, as you're aware, allows an employer to go ahead and send an employee back to school to get additional education, and that additional education up to $5,250 a year goes tax-free to the employee. Great retention tool, great ability to get additional skills. One of the things, and my friend John Thune and I put a bill in that got broad bipartisan support, the chairman supported as well, that said, if we do this on a going forward basis, shouldn't we also allow those employees who have student debt to go ahead and qualify as well and be able to, the employer, pay down that $5,250 a year tax-free? We had it put in place for a year. It got extended to 2025. The take-up rate, though, it seems like such a no-brainer. The take-up rate has been not great. What can we do to help further promote? And this is an area where, regardless of how we feel about student debt, everybody's kind of all in, and it's, again, a great retention tool. And I know I'm over time, so I'll let you, I won't say anything else, Mr. Chairman, but I'd really appreciate an answer.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, the three priorities of our work going ahead are to improve customer service, to increase capacity to assess high-income filers, and to build the backbone of the IRS so that it's on a more stable, modernized footing. That first priority, improve customer service. In my mind, that's doing outreach. That's making sure that taxpayers are aware of the credits that they are eligible for, the benefits that they can participate in. I think there's an education gap, and then maybe a sense of what's available, and then a sense of, well, the IRS is so complicated. Even though that benefit might be there, how am I going to navigate the tax laws to get there? These are two things that we have to close the gap on. We have to make sure that people understand what they're eligible for, and then we have to make sure that they understand that we're working hard to create a much easier path for them to navigate these types of rules. In this case, a benefit to them.
The time of the gentleman's expired. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, for this hearing. And Commissioner, it's great to see you. And I want to congratulate you on your recent confirmation, and thank you for testifying today. Mr. Werfel, before turning to my questions, I want to highlight the importance of remote notarizations for consumers and small businesses, something I just heard about from some constituents last night. As Commissioner, I encourage you to look closely at permanently extending the IRS's common sense policy that makes it easier for families and businesses to use secure remote notarization for tax paperwork. Now on to my questions. Recent reporting has shown how emerging artificial intelligence technologies such as ChatGPT could be used to scam taxpayers by impersonating IRS employees. These AI tools could be used to quickly generate many well-composed, convincing messages that trick taxpayers into providing scammers with personal financial information. For example, one cybersecurity expert used ChatGPT to easily generate a scam message on the employee retention credit that requested sensitive personal information such as social security numbers. So how do you expect AI tools to change how the IRS protects taxpayers from scams? Are the IRS's current anti-fraud programs well suited to help combat scams that use emerging AI technologies?
It's a great question, Senator, and we do have embedded in our operations tools, forensic tools, fraud detection, data and analytics that are have been strengthened over time. And I find as I arrive at the IRS it to be in very good shape in terms of our understanding of the portfolio of fraud that's out there and how we detect it, but we have more work to do. And in particular, this is fast moving. Yeah. This is like this, there's this concept of Moore's Law in terms of how exponential these things move. This is why the Inflation Reduction Act funds are so important. I mean, it's the difference between us being under-resourced and allowing these scams and AI and these emerging solutions to outpace us, or the ability for us to keep pace.
Okay, well, and I would look forward to continuing the conversation with you about ways we can make sure that you are all in a position where you can deal with evolving threats.
Absolutely.
The National Taxpayer Advocate has called paper tax returns the IRS's kryptonite. Many of the frustrating IRS issues faced by my constituents are because of the backlog of unprocessed paper returns. The issues range from families who are struggling to get their refunds to small businesses waiting for employee retention tax credit payments. How does the IRS plan to improve processing of paper returns, and how will you help our constituents stuck in the backlog?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First, scanning is a critical part of this, and we have really started to scale our investment in scanning solutions. We're scanning hundreds of thousands of paper forms now, and that just makes the entire processing much quicker. And I anticipate this, we're getting better and better at it week by week, and I think we're going to start to be able to do a lot more scanning, especially next tax filing season, but right now to deal with our backlog today. The second thing, and I mentioned this to Senator Warner, with the end of tax filing season, we need to start redeploying some of the people that have been on the phones, move them to the paper processing. This is just good seasonal adjustments of workforce, and I anticipate that we're going to make substantial progress on some of the paper backlog as a result of just resetting where the employees sit. But there's other things that we can go into, and again, I go back to the fact that we have to make a decision in terms of what we want from the IRS.
Right.
If we're funded at a steady level or cut, then all we can do is maintain our current operation. We have to make investments to deal with this the complexity of what we see today.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I have a bipartisan proposal that would use barcodes to make paper returns easier to process, and I hope you'll look into that. One last thing before my time runs. A recent report found that innovative partnerships between nurses and tax professionals can help first-time mothers fully access the tax benefits available to families. For example, through the Nurse Family Partnership, nurses have helped connect new mothers to tax filing information and tools which can help moms get benefits such as the child tax credit. How does the IRS support new mothers in accessing tax benefits, and how do you think the IRS can best promote these kinds of innovative partnerships?
I love the idea of partnering with HHS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, to do more to figure out how we can support these types of individuals. It goes back to this significant priority of improved customer service, meeting taxpayers where they are, making sure, A, they understand what they're eligible for, but some taxpayers need more help than others.
Yeah.
And if you're a new mother, if you're struggling in financially in another situation, I want the IRS to have a better understanding of that portfolio of different taxpayer situations and then better strategies for how to reach them. I think we can work with other federal agencies to do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr.
I
Chair.
thank my colleague. Senator Langford's next.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Werfel, it's good to see you again. In this process, you've jumped right into the frying pan. There's a lot of things that need to be done, obviously, at IRS. I'm grateful that you're engaging in this, but we're obviously lacking a lot of details, as you have mentioned, on some of the plan, and you have said that some detail is coming on this. One of the things that and I appreciate the detail is coming, but we're tracking that. One of the issues that you raised where we're not going to do audits, increased audits, for those individuals and businesses with $40,000 or less, as per the Janet Yellen's statement from Treasury. It's difficult for me to be able to track what historic levels may mean, because if I look back on it, and we have gone back to be able to look at what are the historic levels of what audits were done of $40,000 or less. Some years it was very low, and some years it was particularly high statistically on this. We don't know if that's a number, if that's a percentage, and if it's a percentage or a number, which year that is. Is it going to be a group of years? Because if you say this is the historic level, and then you look back 10 years ago or versus 5 years ago versus 15 years ago, that's a very different number. So help us with understanding what the word historic level means.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Senator. Just to clarify it, the pledge is $400,000 a year. What I believe and the message I want to provide to you and to the American people is that we are, for the next number of years, going to be so focused on increasing capacity for high wealth taxpayers, individuals, corporations, and partnerships and complex partnerships that there will be no change to the most recent audit rate we have, the most complete final audit rate we have for years. And then even once we feel like we've done the necessary capacity building in the high wealth area, then it will take years to even get close to what might be a historical average versus where we are today. So when I say where we are today, I want to make clear that we don't have a final audit rate for 21, 22, 20, because it's still possible that there could be audits issued. Right. So we will take the most recent final audit rate, and it's historically low, so it addresses some of your concerns that you raised in your question. And we will allow that to be the marker for at least several years, and then we'll revisit it.
So historic levels means the 21, 22 audit rates.
It goes earlier than that. It's more in the 2018, 2019 range, because it's actually 2018 is now closed, and that's a final audit rate. Right. Where in the other years there's still the potential that that the audit rate could change.
Yeah, I don't mean to pick on this, but this is an issue that we debated actually on the floor during the IRA debate, and Republicans actually brought an amendment saying it can't include that $400,000. It can't include that. Democrats actually voted that amendment down and blocked it. And so this is why this is such a question now, is that I know everyone's saying it won't be that $400,000, but there's nothing in statute that does that, and defining a historical norm and what that is seems to be a moving target on it. So that's helpful for us to get a clarification. It's the 2018 number is what it's going to be.
Yes.
Okay, that's helpful to be able to get, and we'll follow up on it. There's a lot of questions about the individual master file and some of the updating there and the technology you and I have talked about before. The issue of technology, the IRS. I've been in the Senate 8 years. Every single year I hear the IRS has legacy hardware and software. Okay, and that's every single year on it to be able to go from here. I know you're saying with the additional funding you're going to be able to update all those software and hardware systems. Thank you for that. The issue on the individual master file, where that stands in the process, because a lot of things are built on that.
Yeah, well, I think one of the priorities that we put in our plan is the desire to fully update the individual master file by 2028. I think the reason we need to modernize it is a couple of different reasons. One, we want to make sure, and we think the American people deserve to have the most up-to-date technology that's housing that data so that it is as secure as possible. And then obviously with a more technologically sophisticated platform, we can automate more, we can do more, we can meet emerging requirements more quickly. Look, the technology is not all old. And you said there's been investments. The issue is we haven't crossed the finish line. And my goal is to make sure that we are not just, updating this part and that part and not bringing together the full suite of solutions so that that final solution is modernized, and then it'll be less expensive to operate and easier to update in the future. It is a central priority for us going forward.
Look forward to that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank my colleague. Senator Johnson's next.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, quick little comment. If this committee would focus on, spend all of our time and energy on simplifying the tax code, stop trying to socially and engineer through the tax code, a lot of these issues, a lot of these problems would just evaporate or be a whole lot easier to tackle. So that's just my commentary. Mr. Commissioner, welcome. You're quoting statistics of 87% response rate versus 15% last year. Where are you getting those numbers? Because I have something completely different. Do you have the numbers to back up those percentages?
We do, Senator. This is the same methodology that we've used for years.
Okay, well, please provide me those numbers because we
Absolutely.
couldn't find them. The numbers I have, by the way, is last year, 63 million calls, and you answered 21 million for about a response rate of 33%. This year, the calls are way down. I think people just got discouraged. 26 million calls, and 16 million were answered. So you actually answered less according to the numbers I got from the IRS. So I'd like to figure out what that discrepancy is.
Absolutely.
Secondly, with $45 billion flowing into your coffers on enforcement, I am highly concerned about how are you going to keep partisanship out of your enforcement efforts. How do you make sure that enforcement is apolitical? We have examples of the IRS being weaponized. The Tea Party, targeting the Tea Party. The lack of enforcement, quite honestly, when we have emails showing Hunter Biden simply didn't disclose income. We don't see any enforcement action. And the most recent, and I say outrageous example of this, was journalist Matt Taibbi was testifying before the House Judiciary Committee in their weaponization of government. Basically, the day he's testifying, an IRS agent ends up showing up at his home. First of all, how common is that? Listen, I've filed a lot of tax returns, paid a lot of taxes. I've never had an IRS agent show up at my home or my place of business. I mean, how unusual is that to have an IRS agent show up at anybody taxpayer home is kind of the first notice that you've got an issue with your tax returns.
So first of all, Senator, I want to repeat something I said earlier, which is I'm prohibited from discussing.
Understand. So that's why I asked you a general question.
So I say that
what is the normal course of action for notifying a taxpayer if you're going to, for example, reject their tax return?
So we have made public for all taxpayers to see what they can expect from the IRS in terms of when we might call you, when a home visit might occur. It is something that we want to make sure that the taxpayers have an understanding of because there's a lot of scams out there. Mostly, if the IRS is reaching out to you, it's probably not the IRS. So we as part of our, yeah.
So I think this is pretty well documented that an IRS agent showed up, put a note on Mr. Taibbi's doors, called them in 4 days, which he did. They explained what the situation is. I find that unbelievably unusual. And I'm asking you as IRS Commissioner, does that happen often? How unusual is that an IRS agent would show up at a taxpayer's home and tell them, give us a call? Now, throw on top of that an IRS agent showing up at a taxpayer's home, that taxpayer just happens to be testifying before the House Judiciary Committee on the weaponization of government against U.S. citizens. I mean, the chance of that happening is infinitesimal. But it happened. So I'm just saying in general, how often does the IRS show up as the first notice that there may be an issue with the problem with the taxpayer's return and makes a personal appearance at that taxpayer's home? Is that part of your procedures? Does that happen very often?
Again, I want to be cautious in my answer to make sure that I am not violating a prohibition.
That's fine. Talk in general. How often does that happen?
I will talk generally. That if a taxpayer, if the IRS is reaching out to you directly, it is more likely the case that there has been some issue with your return. We've tried reaching you through less intrusive means. We have been unsuccessful. We want to help and get a handle on why you may not have filed, on why you might have an outstanding balance due.
You're not answering my question in terms of how often that would happen. My time's running out, so all I can say is I know Chairman Jordan has sent you and Secretary Yellen a letter requesting all the information on that. I will be sending a similar letter. I'd like it if the chairman would join me in that letter to get this information, because this is very troubling to have the IRS take that type of action. Again, the chances are so infinitesimally small that an IRS agent would show up at the journalist's door the day that journalist is testifying before a House committee. So I'm also going to be requesting that all the documentation, all the information on that specific case. I believe Mr. Taibbi has already issued a waiver for the IRS to provide that information. So I'm asking, will you comply with that, with those requests? Will you turn that information over to myself and to Chairman Jordan?
As long as we can do it consistent with Section 6103, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank my colleagues. Senator Blackburn's next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back to us. Just tagging on to what Senator Johnson was saying, I think it's important to note with the Lois Lerner scandals and targeting that took place at the IRS, you're very familiar with that because you were brought in to help clean that up. And when there's the perception that people are being targeted and there is anecdotal evidence and that information makes it to us, it does mean that we need to question you about this. And you know what a debacle that was during Ms. Lerner's time. I want to return to where I was with you in the first hearing. And we talked about the Sitka and the $400,000 limit, how you were going to be able to put that in place and not have it affect people that have tip income that are actually making less than $400,000 a year. And as we discussed, I don't think you were able to give me an example of someone you knew or any profession you knew that would make $400,000 a year that was working for tips. So if the IRS enforcement focus is on taxpayers that are making $400,000, then how do you justify this Sitka program, and how are you going to handle this so that it does not become a mandate on employers?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And again, I think it's absolutely the case, and I want to reaffirm that those individuals that are making less than $400,000 will see no new wave of audits or no increase in the audit rate, as I've described earlier in this hearing. On the question of...
But you will be increasing their taxes.
Well, this is a question that I think we need to do better outreach with the associations, restaurants, tipped workers, to make sure that we are getting better aligned. This
Is your
better
goal to
customer
make the
service.
program mandatory?
The
Right
goal-
now, it's voluntary. Are you trying to make this mandatory?
I have no intention.
No intention. Okay, let me move on. You talked earlier about the historical rate of audits, but previously you had said, you and Yellen had each said that you were not going to raise taxes. The president has said no one making under $400,000 a year is going to see their taxes raised. So now that has changed to no more than historical levels. So if you will give us in writing how you're couching that. Is it 5-year levels? Is it 10-year levels? Is it going back to 2018 and setting it there? Was that a high mark? Was it a low mark? I think there needs to be a little bit more clarity on that. And I would also like to hear from you, because this is causing great confusion. How do you calculate the $400,000? How are you, is it based on adjusted gross? Is it based on net? How are you arriving at this number? And the reason I ask this, Commissioner, is because Tennessee is a very entrepreneurial state. And as you know, we have a lot of people in the music industry. We have a lot of people that do tours, that work with these tours. They're self-employed. They're independent contractors. And while they may have a higher gross, their net is very low. So it's important to have definition around what do you mean, what is 400,000 gross, adjusted gross, net. Where are you pegging that?
Yep. Okay, so on that question, we're going to look at total positive income as our metric. So if the return comes in and the total positive income on the return is under 400,000, then we will know that it's in a segment of population that would receive no.
Does that increase their audit rate?
No, that's the point. There would be no increased likelihood of an audit if they have less than 400,000 in total positive income.
Okay. Let's go back to the issue we previously discussed about teleworking.
Please.
Teleworking, and I know that Senator Thune talked a little bit about the phones not being answered, which is something that we hear quite a bit. You've got a heavy lift to go, and I would love to know what percentage of your employees are currently in the office working and how many are teleworking, and are you pulling that VPN data and auditing that? That's what you ought to be auditing, to see if they're actually conducting business, logged in, working, or if they're asleep on the job.
Senator, let me offer you this. First of all, I want to clarify, all employees are working. In my first few weeks at the IRS, I focused my questions as follows. Are we answering the calls? And we answered 87%. Are we in our taxpayer assistance centers and our walk-in centers, keeping the lines short, meeting all of our appointments? And we are. Are we making progress on processing the paper backlog? We are. Are we defending cyber attacks? And we defend 1 billion cyber attacks successfully a year. I understand the question. I think also OMB just issued guidance last week on telework, so I'm going to now turn to that and figure out how to make sure that the IRS is aligned with the rest of the government. But I would say that the success we've had with the filing season was the most important metric for me to start with before I got into the details of where someone might be working.
Time of the gentlelady has expired, and I just want to say, because we're getting ready to make sure that everybody gets a chance to ask questions. The program Senator Blackburn has been talking about, a small business program, is voluntary, and I want to assure colleagues, as long as I'm chairman of this committee, it will not be mandatory. Period. Full stop. It will not be mandatory. Senator Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very, very much for being here. We really appreciate your service. During your confirmation hearing, I raised concerns about how the IRS considered taxing Colorado's state tax refund, which we call TABOR refunds. I also sent a letter out about this yesterday. As you may remember, the IRS notified Colorado taxpayers in the middle of filing season, right when people were filing their taxes, that it could tax their TABOR refund. In 30 years, the IRS has never done that before. And in February, the IRS issued guidance saying it wouldn't tax TABOR refunds for the 2022 tax year, which we appreciate, but the guidance also opened the door to tax these refunds in the future. In the fine print, the IRS grouped state tax payments into two categories. The first category was state tax refunds, which the IRS almost never taxes, and the second category was general welfare and disaster relief payments, which the IRS is more likely to tax down the road. And for reasons that I still can't understand, the IRS put Colorado's TABOR funds in the second category. And I think that the TABOR refunds should have been placed in the first category. They are state tax refunds. This is how the IRS has treated them for 30 years. TABOR refunds only go out, as I think you know, Commissioner, to Coloradans when the state collects more in taxes than we allow in state law. It's a tax refund. It's not a form of income, and it has been treated that way for 3 decades. During your confirmation hearing, you committed to working with my office and the state of Colorado ahead of the next filing season about this. Could you talk about how you're thinking about this now and give some assurance, I hope, to people in Colorado about how this is going to be treated?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I've had some time to start to roll up my sleeves and look at the issue, and obviously there's multiple states that are impacted here. There's questions about the transition of out of the pandemic, where there's different treatments for COVID payments versus not, and I agree. There's confusion, and we need to remediate that confusion. The one thing I will tell you is that we will not allow there to be confusion next filing season. And I want to make sure that you and the state of Colorado and other states impacted have a heads up in terms of how we are sorting through this issue so that there's great clarity going into the next filing season next year. I also need to sort through, Senator Bennett, whose decision, this is a question that came up earlier, who gets to decide? Is it you, Commissioner? Is it the Secretary of the Treasury? Is it Congress? On this one, I'm working with my colleagues at Treasury to make sure that I understand, is this a tax policy call or an IRS administrative call? Bottom line, as we head deeper into spring, but before the summer, I will come meet with you in your office and let you know where this is headed in terms of what the process is, and make sure that you and the state have a heads up in terms of what the moving pieces are.
I appreciate that, Commissioner. I hate to say this, but I think probably I don't get to make the call, and I hope, though, that the people that are looking at this come to understand that the IRS has made this call the same way for 30 years. I mean, it is really aggravating and irritating that this happened during the middle of tax filing season.
Absolutely.
I appreciate your saying that won't be repeated, but that's only part of it. The part of it is upsetting an expectation that really has existed for decades. And I know there are other states involved in this. There is no other state that has TABOR. It's you know that, and so I hope you'll consider that. And I had another question for you about, but I don't have time, so I'm going to submit it for the record. But about the importance of staffing at the IRS and the importance, for example, of having a tax counsel there to be able to help do the work that you're going to be required to do. Because I think honestly, I think part of the problem we ran into the last time we were going through this was the department wasn't staffed up in the way that it needed to be, and people were making decisions maybe without having without being in a position to feel like they had the latitude to, I don't know, I can't explain it, but can you say a word about the importance of having a tax counsel at the IRS?
It's absolutely critical. Look, there's only 2 Senate confirmed positions in the IRS, my position and the chief counsel's position. It's really important that we have a chief lawyer at the IRS, because as we've been discussing so many of these issues, and every one of these issues actually has complicated legal elements. So, we have to recruit lawyers in, we have to work with other Senate-confirmed general counsels across government. Not having a Senate-confirmed general counsel is an impediment, and I'm hoping that we can and that the administration can put a name before this committee.
That's the point. Senator Bennett's absolutely right. We need a nomination. The time of my
Thank you, Mr.
colleagues
Chairman.
expired. Senator Daines is next.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Commissioner Werfel, I'd like to begin by addressing my Putting First Responders First Act, which was signed into law as part of the retirement legislation that we considered in this committee last Congress. This law will make compensation received by disabled first responders tax exempt even after retirement, and importantly, will end the improper audits of disabled first responders that stem from ambiguity around the retirement age. However, the version that was signed into law moved the effective date of the bill to 2026, which was different from the committee-passed version that had this provision taking effect immediately. The unfortunate consequence of this is that erroneous IRS audits of disabled first responders could continue for the next few years. I ask for your commitment to immediately end the improper audits of disabled first responders in a question for the record following your confirmation hearing. And frankly, I was very dissatisfied with the response. Now you've been confirmed. Congratulations. I'm going to give you another opportunity to answer this, which I believe is a very straightforward question. It's this: will you commit to ending the improper audits of disabled first responders?
Well, first of all, Senator, I want to thank you for championing this really important issue. I think it's absolutely critical, and I am committed to helping you with your objective. What I can commit to you is us issuing clarifying guidance that will assist disabled first responders when they're preparing their tax returns. We're going to conduct outreach with them. We're going to walk them through the guidance. We're going to try to mitigate the risk of there being an issue of follow-up. If there is an issue of follow-up, we will work directly with them to address it. I can't commit, to exclude all audits on any one topic. I just can't go that far, but it has my attention. It's a priority for me, and we will work with this community to get it right.
I tried to make it easy. I said improper audits. That's why I said,
Fair enough.
let me give you a chance to answer it again.
Yes.
Will you commit to ending improper audits of disabled first responders? I think that, I know
Yes,
some, I know.
I will.
Yes,
I
it's a
did
yes or no,
understand
and
your
I'm trying to give you the lanes here to make it clear. And look,
It's
as you
a
know,
good
a lot of folks
clarification.
watch these responses. And our first responders, when you hear their stories who have been disabled while on duty, there's a lot of terrible stories about what's happened here in terms of the IRS coming after them, and they live in fear, not knowing that the most frightening letter to get in the mail is a letter from the IRS. It's like an audit, and they're already dealing with so many issues. So I heard you say yes.
I did.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And you have a lot of families of disabled first responders who will be relieved to hear that answer. And look, this committee passed it. This was our intent. And thank you for taking maybe some anxiety and anxiousness away from families that are already dealing with a lot of pain.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. Commissioner Werfel, you've been quick to tout the success of the IRS and the taxpayer experience. However, I think it depends a bit on what metric you're looking at. Prior to getting in public service, I was working for companies, Procter & Gamble being one of them. Another was a cloud computing company that we focused on a CRM suite for large, both public entities and private entities that had a B2C kind of model here and taking care of customers. You're touting an 84% customer satisfaction rate for toll-free assistance, but simultaneously the IRS is seemingly deprioritizing suspended tax returns, amended tax returns, and correspondence. There's literally tens of millions of items languishing. I know all of us here, when we are working with constituent services, deal with our constituents who are saying, we feel like we're tow trucks to go in and get some return that's in the ditch somewhere and pull them out to help the people that we serve. Should Treasury and the IRS really be taking a victory lap at this point based on cherry-picked metrics like the highly misleading and often criticized level of service for some of us toll-free assistance?
So I have several thoughts in response. First of all, I think the issue with the backlog of paper returns is we actually are making dramatic progress. I mean, we were at 20 million backlog, and that was caused by COVID. Mm-hmm. And we never had a backlog like this before, but we had to shut down our operations right in the spring of 2020 as the world was shutting down. So days and days of paper piling up, and we're still catching up, and we're making progress. Like, we cut it in half last year to this year. Now we have to, during filing season, we have to redirect resources to the phones. We don't have as much staff that we can manage the paper backlog. With the end of filing season, we anticipate making more progress. But I also want to address your question about the victory lap. I think it's absolutely critical for the American people to understand that when we are funded at the right level, then we can be there to answer the call. That they don't have to wait for 25, 30 minutes on the phone wondering if they're ever going to get through. If we don't have that funding, then we can't staff the customer service centers with the right amount of people. It's math. Yep. It's a question of volume and can we meet the demand? And I think that's why we want to celebrate this.
So I'm out of time, but just one thought on that is as you look at your metrics, perhaps, and sometimes it's not as much enjoyment in looking at metrics that still are very discouraging, but you can talk about the improvements. So if 20 million was the number and you're down to 10 million, let's track that number and report on that and just keep it public as you're chipping away on that and the scoreboarding idea here to get that down to
Time of the gentleman's expired.
Okay.
Senator Warren.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for years, lobbyists and anti-tax extremists have worked to gut the IRS to prevent it from chasing down wealthy tax cheats and to keep it from being able to help Americans who are honestly trying to file their taxes. But thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS now has the resources it needs to make tax filing free and easy. This has been on the IRS agenda, their to-do list, for decades. Back in 2003, the IRS set up the Free File program, which was a partnership with companies like Intuit and H&R Block that was supposed to make filing free for 70% of taxpayers. But today, that Free File program serves just 2% of Americans. And that's because the tax prep companies sabotaged the program so they could keep raking in money, deliberately hiding Free File web pages from Google searches and confusing eligible taxpayers by marketing other fake free programs to them, only to scam them by collecting a fee later on. So let me start here, Commissioner Werfel. Do you agree that the current Free File program is a failure?
I agree. It's not reaching as many people as it should.
Yeah,
So,
the difference between 2% and 70%.
It's massive.
I think that's a failure. Tax prep companies have sabotaged the Free File program. They've tricked and trapped American taxpayers into paying for alternative services that should be free, that are marketed as free, but in fact, they don't make free. And the result is that today the IRS reports that Americans waste an average of 13 hours and $250 each year filing their taxes. And the Treasury Department analysts estimate that about 12 million low-income Americans miss out on thousands of dollars in refunds, likely because it is too expensive and too difficult to file through these supposedly free options. So, Commissioner Werfel, do you agree that the private tax filing options that companies are pushing instead of Free File is also failing American taxpayers?
the whole process needs to be improved. I agree. We need better clarity. When I hear the premise of your question, I think about the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and just ticking off, 3 of them were violated just in your question in terms of the implication. So we have an obligation to make the tax system easier for taxpayers to navigate. And, Congress hands us a very complicated tax code.
I understand that.
And we have to make it simpler. And so, I want to work with you and with this committee and with taxpayers to make that process easier. And if they are eligible for free file and they're not taking advantage of that or getting tripped up along the way, what can we do to help?
Okay. So, look, the Government Accountability Office, the National Taxpayer Advocate, Treasury Secretary Yellen, many of our colleagues on this committee all agree that it is high time for the IRS to develop its own truly free and easy way for hardworking Americans to file their taxes and to claim their refunds. And thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS now has the resources to do so, including dedicated funding to develop a roadmap for direct e-filing options with a report to Congress due next month. Now, I'm looking forward to the report. You don't have to say here what it's going to do. I know we'll have an opportunity then to talk more about the specifics of what the IRS can do to help tax filers. But broadly speaking, Commissioner Werfel, can you explain why offering free and easy way to file directly with the IRS would help American taxpayers, particularly low-income and middle-income families?
Yeah, again, as you said, we're issuing a report by congressional mandate in mid-May, and that will walk through a lot of the issues. I think one of the goals that we have at the IRS is to increase the options that taxpayers have to engage with us. If they want a fully digital, they should have a fully digital. If they want to do it in paper, we're not thrilled with that, but we have to meet taxpayers where they are. And if they want to come directly to the IRS versus working through a third party, we now have the opportunity to study that and tell Congress what the implication of that is. As a guiding principle, the more workable options, the better. But because Congress asked and has legitimate questions about the issues associated with the direct file program, we're going to answer them, and then I'll come back in mid or late May, and we can talk through what the report said.
Well, I look forward to that. I think it's clear, though, Americans deserve an IRS that ensures that folks at the top pay what they owe, and that honest, hardworking Americans can file their taxes without spending an excessive amount of time or a lot of money to get that done. And I think that's where we're aiming. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I'm just thinking as I listen to this, we've been working for more workable options for decades now. So it's time to figure it out. Okay, next is, let's see, Senator Cortez Masto.
Got the lottery here. How are you?
I'm
good to see you. Thank you for joining us, Commissioner. Always appreciate your attentiveness in response to questions and calls as well. Let me talk to you about something that hasn't been discussed here, but it is important for many of us who are dealing with, unfortunately, disasters in our communities and governor-declared disasters. This winter, Nevada has dealt with a series of severe storms which have resulted in major damage, causing widespread flooding, rock slides, landslides. They have threatened communities and contributed to more than $10 million in damages to our public infrastructure. The governor and our federal delegation have asked President Biden to issue a major disaster declaration. But I wanted to discuss how issues like this can impact tax filing. I have a bipartisan bill that would allow the IRS to delay the tax filing deadlines upon the written request of a governor when a disaster has been declared. It's very critical that we have this, what we are seeing, wildfires, disasters happening, and it has an impact, and I'm hearing from my constituents, unfortunately, who are dealing with these disasters, on their ability to try to file these taxes. So my question, I guess, Commissioners, to you is, do you agree with the need to provide taxpayers flexibility in meeting that filing deadline when something like a natural disaster occurs?
I do. I mean, we have a long history of extending deadline and creating flexibilities for individuals impacted by natural disasters. I think it's an important function for the IRS to not have a one-size-fits-all approach and assume every taxpayer is in the same situation. We appreciate having those tools. The final position the administration can offer on any bill is rest with the Treasury Department, but as a guiding principle, tools to help taxpayers in need are something that we're very interested in the IRS.
Thank you. That's what I'm hearing from you today in your answers to my colleagues' questions. Let me jump to a separate subject. Immigrants face unique barriers to filing taxes. As a result, we have seen lower immigrant uptake rates of tax credits, such as the child tax credit, especially in Latino families. Two questions I have for you is, what steps is the IRS taking to remove barriers to filing taxes and receiving tax credits? And currently, it is my understanding that the IRS does not allow ITIN applications to be processed electronically and requires that ITIN applicants file a tax return along with their application. And I guess my question to you is, would you consider eliminating these barriers for ITIN applicants? So two questions, if you would, regarding the ITIN applications, and how do we deal with these barriers to filing taxes and receiving tax credits for some of our members of our immigrant communities who wants to file taxes?
Yeah, I think it's been a theme of this hearing in terms of, taxpayers that are eligible for benefits, refunds, credits. We recently announced publicly, and we tried to make a lot of press about it, that file because the statute of limitations on your refunds are expiring. We have a lot of unclaimed refunds. People who can file, who can claim their refunds, are not doing so, and we want to make sure that we're paying people what they're owed.
So how do you reach out to those immigrant communities, the Latino communities, who are paying taxes but or want to pay their taxes?
Yes.
But there's barriers to them. Maybe a language barrier.
Yeah, we have to do more with our stakeholders, the intermediaries. We have to work more in communities. I mean, Senator, earlier I was talking about one of the reasons why I'm excited about the Inflation Reduction Act plan that we issued is that it really does allow us to establish three very clear priorities. The first priority I listed was customer service. And that's not just about answering the phones. And it's not just about improving the call center, all of which are important. It's also about outreach. It's about better understanding taxpayers. They're a diverse group. They're not all in the same situation. Some are struggling because of a disaster. Some are struggling because of they're acclimating to the United States in some way. And some are struggling because they financially can't afford to pay what they owe. And we want to get them on installment agreements and help them that way. We can do better in all of those outreach efforts. And I'm looking forward to working with the team at the IRS to do that.
Thank you. And then I know my time is up. Finally, in response to your conversation earlier with Senator Johnson, as you provide that feedback and that information that he requested to the chair, can you distinguish between the two? You have auditors and you have investigators. You have criminal investigators that investigate for fraud, criminal fraud, and then you have auditors that are looking at the tax returns of individuals and corporations. Can you, when you provide that information, distinguish between the two?
Yes.
And would an individual receive outreach from an auditor if there is a technical question that auditor has about their tax return?
Yes.
Okay, so that could be separate from a criminal investigator that may be responding to an investigation they're doing for criminal fraud,
Yes.
correct?
Yeah, and we try to be clear, and we can ramp up our communication efforts on this. When you can expect to be contacted by the IRS, it can happen, and it typically happens because there are questions that we have about what you filed. It might be a criminal question, it might be just an audit question, but it does happen. And one of the things that I'm worried about is that we need to make clear that more often than not, if someone's telling you they're from the IRS, they're not, and it's a scam. So it's not easy to navigate, but we do need at times, and we're going to try to be as transparent as possible, to reach out to taxpayers. And I'm really committed to creating a culture in the IRS where when we're doing outreach, it's to help. This is this customer service point.
Time of my colleagues expired. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, I've said to you privately, thank you for returning to public service. IRS commissioner is not the easiest job on the planet, especially when you're subject to political attacks pretty much all the time, but glad you're up to the task. Earlier, you told Senator Wyden how much IRS services improved since last filing season. Things are getting better. My constituents are still frustrated with IRS, no surprise, particularly small businesses waiting to receive the employee retention tax credit to which they're entitled. I know your staff's working on resolving these cases. I appreciate your attention to it. I know you touched on outreach to Senator Warner earlier. Last fall, IRS sent letters to 9 million households that appeared to be eligible for the EITC or CTC, something that Senator Wyden has made such a priority in this committee, but haven't claimed them. We know that roughly 1 in 5 EITC-eligible households don't claim it. What are some of your findings from last fall's outreach? How will you build off it to improve outreach to these households?
Yeah, I think the reality is that we have work to do, in particular, Senator, because what we're seeing happen too often is that individuals are seeking to encourage people to apply for the credit that aren't actually eligible. So we're seeing some challenges, improper payments or fraud in the system that we have to weed through. That doesn't mean we don't want to make sure that people, again, understand what they're eligible for. So I think there's more take-up rate that can happen, and we are seeing employee credits come in, retention credits and other types of credits still come in the door. But every time we do an outreach effort, we learn something, and we're on a continuous improvement journey. So the challenge is, how do we hit the right people with the right set of guidance, make sure they understand, help them navigate the complexity. They may be disincentivized because they think it's going to be too hard. How do we answer those questions effectively? And how do we also create an important firewall to make sure that people are not duped by nefarious players that are trying to take advantage of that?
Speaking of that, could you reduce improper payments if Congress let you regulate paid tax preparers?
Yes.
Okay, important to know. And when you were here last, I asked you about the 1099-K reporting threshold. My concern that this was a burden on Ohioans, a burden on third-party platforms, and a burden on the IRS. Would a higher threshold make this simpler for you to administer so that IRS can focus its resources more efficiently? And therefore, would you support congressional efforts to increase the threshold?
So I'll answer the first question. Absolutely, yes. The higher the threshold, it would reduce volume, it would reduce complexity, it would make the IRS's job a lot easier. In terms of whether we can support, that's an issue that I always have to defer to Treasury on.
Okay.
On any piece of legislation, I do not have the authority to give the administration's position. It's Treasury that does that.
Okay. I know Senator Hessen, as you know, we've talked to Senator Hessen and I are working on this to increase the threshold to $10,000, cutting down on red tape for taxpayers and doing the advantages to IRS that you mentioned. Last question. I'd like to see the new energy tax credits from the IRA work in support of American manufacturing, spurring genuine domestic supply chains, particularly in the solar industry where so much capacity needs to be built quickly. My state, in northwestern Ohio, has the largest solar manufacturer in the country. Tell us about IRS plans to administer these manufacturing credits to minimize administrative burden and delays to issuing the credits so that the critical IRA funding will truly benefit these reshoring efforts.
We have a lot of work to do, Senator. We've issued a variety of different notices. We've requested information. We're taking in a ton of input from a variety of different stakeholders about how they want to see IRS regulation and IRS guidance issued. I expect that we'll issue in the coming months additional notices of proposed rulemaking. And we're going to get a lot of comments. And I think I was answering a question earlier, I think from Senator Cornyn, about there's a lot of moving pieces to track in terms of different input and different stakeholders, and the right way to do it is to go out with an advance or a notice, lay out the issues, collect the feedback, and then publicly discuss as much as possible the various trade-offs we need to make in making these work. And I look forward to talking to you once we have a fuller set of feedback from the various stakeholders as part of our notice and comment rulemaking, where things are landing and getting your feedback.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Senator Brown, good points, and I particularly appreciate your hammering away on solar manufacturing. We are going to regret it deeply in this country if we look back at this period and we gave short shrift to solar manufacturing. A lot of panels coming from overseas. I get all that. We've got to manufacture more at home. Thank you for making the point. Our next question will be Senator Young.
Good to see you, Commissioner. Thanks for being here today. I know you've only been on the job for a short period of time, and there are no doubt a whole number of improvements you'd like to see made that have not yet been fully carried out. So with that in mind, I want to first focus on some trends that we've seen in this 2023 tax filing season. In your remarks today, you stated that the tax filing season has gone well. Among other things, you point to the IRS's phone performance, claiming to have answered more calls from taxpayers seeking our help than in 2022. On this particular point, I'd have to refer you back to our own reported numbers. 3.9 million is the number of lower calls as of April 8th that the IRS has answered in 2023 as compared to that same time last year. So there are 3.9 million fewer calls. But beyond this, I'd like to reflect on a few additional IRS-provided numbers given to us by TIGTA that are not routinely reported to the public, all as of April 1st of this year. 10.5 million are the number of calendar year 2022 and 2023 our original tax returns that have not been fully processed because they've been suspended. 3 million is the number of these returns that the IRS considers to be overaged, which works out to nearly 30%. 6.7 million is the number of calendar year 22 and 23 amended tax returns that have not been processed. And 4.7 million is the number of these returns that the IRS considers to be overaged, which works out to be more than 70%. I'm almost done painting the picture here. 10.25 million is the number of calendar year 22 and 23 items of taxpayer correspondence that have not been worked. And 5.9 million, the last number here, is the number of these items that the IRS considers to be overage, which works to be almost 60%. So, you know, it's nice to hear that the average call wait times have decreased for those who call and are actually able to connect to the IRS. Call volume to the IRS is down significantly year to year. Despite this decrease, the backlog of taxpayer inventory continues. So just to clarify, Commissioner Werfel, after getting all these numbers on the record and trying to bring some clarity to the picture, do you believe that the tax filing season has gone well for the tens of millions of Americans whose original returns remain suspended, amended returns remain unprocessed, or correspondence languishes in a bin somewhere, none of whom are receiving their refunds or having their questions or issues addressed in the meantime?
Yeah, I would say compared to last year, the tax filing season has been a dramatic improvement. I think it's important to amplify that, Senator, because it was only possible with additional resources and our ability to add more staff. We did make progress on the backlog, but not enough progress. This started during COVID. We never had a backlog like this before. But when we had to shut down our operations, we had trucks full of returns sitting in the parking lots that we couldn't process until we could get back to operations. And I will say this, IRS employees came back earlier than any other federal employees, had to work social distance. It was really heroic what the IRS was able to do in the spring of 2020 as COVID was unfolding. But this raises the key point, which is how do we build an infrastructure in the IRS so that we can do both, so that we can manage the call volume and reduce the call volume? I don't know if my number is right or your number is right. We'll get to the bottom of that.
These numbers are right. These numbers are right.
But if you say that the call volume went down, that's actually a good thing. That means that that our website is working effectively. That means that our apps are working on our smartphones more effectively. If we can build that infrastructure and modernize, it's an example. If we just operate at the same budget or less, then maybe we can answer the calls. If we have investments, then maybe we can build the callback option
Well,
so that people don't have to wait.
Right. What the committee wants, what I want, what I think you and certainly my constituents want, Commissioner, is to make sure that we're getting and giving the whole picture here in terms of what the taxpayer is experiencing and what the IRS's performance is. So you want to be transparent. I voted to confirm you in this position because I still believe that, and I did at the time. Yet it's not transparent when the bad news of filing season, there's a mix of good and bad, is provided by inspectors general, while the IRS solely highlights what it believes to be, the most positive facts. So going forward, just in short, will you do everything you can to increase full transparency with respect to the IRS's performance, good and bad, Commissioner?
Yeah, I love the idea of a balanced scorecard, Senator, and
Yes.
absolutely. I think the reason why I want to amplify the positives is because I want to make sure that it's understood how important fully funding this base operation is.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Senator Whitehouse.
Commissioner,
Yes.
use and abuse of 501c4 entities in the political space. That
Yes.
is ability for overseeing.
That's
So the Citizens United decision of the Supreme Court posited something that I have no disagreement with, which is that if big political spending is not transparent, it is corrupting. That is why transparency was so important to that decision. Political spending that is not transparent is corrupting. That is the law of the land. And we have massive, non-transparent political spending taking place, corrupting political spending. It's over $2 billion, and it could be a lot more depending on reporting glitches. So here are some of the problems that we see emerging. First of all, to play in the political space with 501c3s and 501c4s, the current state of the art is to have a twinned 501c3 and 501c4. The 501c3 isn't supposed to do any politics at all. 501c4 is only supposed to do half. The 501c3s and the 501c4s tend to have the same locations, the same staff, the same boards, the same funders, and yet nobody's looking at piercing the corporate veil and seeing whether the 501c3s are being used to improperly support 501c4 political effort. So I would like to have you take a look at that question. Second, 501c4s are only supposed to do less than half on politics, but what we see is associated 501c4s that are providing a orchestrated cascade where the donor gives, let's say, $1 million to front group 501c4 front group number 1, which spends half of that on politics, and gives the other half to front group number 2, which spends half of that on politics. Now we're up to $750,000, which gives that other $250 to another related front group, another $125. Now you're up to $875,000. One more, and you're over $900,000 out of the $1 million being spent on politics in a coordinated way, conceivably around a single table in a single meeting room. And finally, we have instances of what seems to be massive self-enrichment in this environment as people seem to be paying each other off, again, using these 501c3 and 501c4 mechanism. My challenge to you is that I have seen big blowback from big special interests when the IRS has tried to do its job in this space. I think you saw some of that pretty close to hand. And I think that the IRS has chickened out and refused to do its job in this space because they fear that political blowback. And they've created basically a lawless arena here in which the ref has chickened out and left the field. And I ask you to pull up your socks, do your job, look at these 501c3s and 501c4s, and in particular, look at these new behaviors with the numbers being so massive, with the coordination between 501c3s and 501c4s being so suspect, and with the 50% rule being flouted, to the extent it made any sense to the beginning, being flouted by coordinated groups of 501c4s operating in conjunction. Will you do that?
So, Senator, it's interesting that you used the referee analogy. I shared with the team when I arrived at the IRS that it does feel like the IRS is the referee in that we get booed whether we get the call right or we get the call wrong. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's our role. But we can't leave the field. You know, we can take the boos, but we have to be on the field. So my answer to you is if we are falling short of our responsibilities, then we have to take a close look at that and figure out what we're doing. We
Looks
have
to
to
me
meet our
like you're completely
responsibilities.
falling short, that you've vacated the field, that there's no effort being put into any of this because of the harassment that the IRS received when it last took a look in these areas.
I think I would ask.
If I'm wrong, please correct me and with a.
Well, I think
for the
there's,
record.
you're not wrong in that it's an extremely complicated space. We learned 10 years ago that how complicated a space it is. It asks the IRS to answer questions that are extremely sensitive, and places that onus on the IRS. In an environment where we're trying to build trust with taxpayers and improve the overall dynamic that we have with taxpayers. So I think
My time's up, so we'll follow up as needed
Yeah, we're
on
gonna have
that.
to follow
Let me
up,
also just
Senator.
quickly thank you for your work on our reciprocal FATCA
Yep.
bill, and I think that's important to both stemming offshore tax evasion and dealing with kleptocrat assets, and I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Carver.
Thanks, Senator Crable. Welcome back. It seems like about a month ago that you were sitting here and we're having your confirmation hearing. Your parents and your spouse and your children were all sitting behind you, full of joy and pride. And I hope they still feel that way. And again, we're so grateful to all of them for sharing you with our country.
Somehow I'm
This
2
new
inches
role.
shorter now, Senator. No, I'm
Well, you
doing
don't
great.
look it. You don't
Doing
look
great. I've got a great team holding me up here.
That's good. Today, there are no minimum standards, as you know, for our professional requirements for paid tax preparers. It's not a new issue. This is one we've talked about and, frankly, not done enough about for years. But the problem too often results in error-filled tax filings, sometimes outright fraud, as you know. While most preparers provide excellent service to their clients, the IRS receives tens of thousands of complaints each year about bad actors. And for these reasons, the General Accountability Office has recommended again and again and again that the IRS, Congress give the IRS the authority to establish standards to properly regulate paid preparers, especially those who may be acting in bad faith or preparing inaccurate tax returns. Again, this is not a new issue. It's one that we've actually, I think, discussed before. How is the IRS managing the risk associated with paid preparers who knowingly or unknowingly prepare inaccurate returns? And what more should the Congress do to further protect taxpayers?
Senator, it's such an important issue. As I move up my learning curve every day on tax administration, you start to see that there are moments where problems occur and there isn't a victim. It's a mistake. The wrong amount may be paid. The victim might be the government's finances, but there isn't an individual person that's a victim. But in the cases that you raise, there are victims. There are people that are being taken advantage of, often vulnerable populations, unsuspecting, and it can be heartbreaking and it's angering. And I want the IRS to be doing its part to really kind of close this type of stuff down and to be as aggressive as we can be in dealing with these nefarious individuals who are creating victims in order to financially benefit themselves through the tax system. More tools would be helpful. As I said earlier, I can't comment formally on legislation. That's the domain of the Treasury Department. But we always welcome tools that can help us do more outreach or crack down on fraud and on the type of behavior where the result is a victim. And so I know that we have teams of people at the IRS that are looking at these nefarious preparers trying to determine how we can get to them earlier. There's a lot of education. During filing season, Senator, we do something we call the Dirty Dozen, which is where we outline the tax scams that are out there. We try to promote it, get as much publicity as we can out to Americans that these are the types of things to be on the lookout for. And scamming preparers is one of the things that is like always front and center in our Dirty Dozen.
Okay,
so
thank you.
helping get the message out is critical.
Good. Thanks for that. I think Senator Warren may raise before I arrived at the hearing today the issue of no-cost filing services and
Yes.
expanding those. But with the 2023 tax filing season coming to a close, many of my constituents recently went through the complex and often costly process of filing their tax returns. My wife and I did too. But while the Free File program was created to simplify this process at no cost to for lower-income taxpayers, the program is not working as intended. And a review of the program that I requested from GAO, from the General Accountability Office, not long ago found that the program's utilization rate is drastically low, disappointingly low, with I think some 4% of eligible taxpayers using the program in 2020, 4%. In response to GAO recommended the IRS offer additional options for free online filing service. Fortunately, thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, as you know, the IRS now has the resources to expand access to free, simplified filing options, which would improve tax compliance and strengthen the fairness of the tax system. Here's my question. What are the benefits of expanding no-cost filing options for low and middle-income taxpayers, and what action is the IRS taking to make it easier and more accessible now for taxpayers to file their tax returns in future years?
Yeah. So the main benefit is options. You know, different taxpayers have different preferences based on their preference, based on their position in terms of how they're going to engage with the IRS. You know, we would love all taxpayers to engage with us in a more digital way, but not all taxpayers can. Some of them want to walk into our walk-in centers, and we've been able to open more walk-in centers with the Inflation Reduction Act. The benefit, Senator, is options. Taxpayers need options. And the other benefit is if we can implement these options in a way that simplifies a very complicated journey that can often be very intimidating, then we've created a true benefit to America and to citizens, that they have optionality, and we've made their job easier of complying with the code.
Thank you.
And the Inflation Reduction Act does provide us needed resources to be able to build those channels. Now, I know there's this one question that's out there on direct file, and as I mentioned earlier, we are mandated by the Inflation Reduction Act to study it. I think when we produce that study, we'll be able to discuss potential issues, strategies, what to do from here.
All right, thanks so much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cassidy.
Thank you. Commissioner, thank you for being here. During your confirmation hearings, I asked if the IRS would consider having a third-party vendor to do your IT management. And at the time, I submitted for the record news reports going back to the 1980s where IRS has requested lots more money, and then a lot of news reports that said they have not accomplished what they attempted to do. It's like, you know, Christmas. Every year, IRS wants more money for IT, and every year there's reports that it's delayed. So you had suggested an openness to the concept then. Has that been acted upon, analyzed, in any way encouraged?
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at our IT strategy, I'm moving up my learning curve on where we are with our technology. And what I've learned is, look, there have been successes. And I'm very interested in those successes, and I can talk to you about them. Why am I so interested in these successes? Because what were the preconditions for those success? Why were we able to build and deploy a successful modernized e-file program? How did that happen? And then there are non-successes. You know, there are areas where we set out to accomplish something, for example, to fully modernize the individual master file, and we've only made progress, but we haven't fully modernized it. And so
that's how many years overdue?
You could look at different time frames, but it's years overdue in terms of being fully modernized. But there are elements of it that are modern.
So let me ask, just because I have other questions.
Please.
Has contracting with a third party, such as Department of Defense does, for some of these services, been part of the considerations?
Yes, and one of the things that I've also learned is that about 2/3 of our IT spend is on contractors, 1/3 on IRS employees. That doesn't mean that that's the right level.
Now, of course, contractors is separate from going to the cloud with.
I think, and you raised that during the confirmation hearing, and I'm absolutely pushing the team to look at cloud, service-oriented architectures like cloud as an alternative.
Great.
Absolutely.
Don't mean to cut you off. I just got limited time.
No, I get you.
Okay, next. In 2020, the IRS made final regulations regarding guidance on the definition of medical care under Section 213D of the IRS Code. Essentially, that primary services, what primary services are and are not qualified medical expenses for the purposes of HSAs. And the final rules said that direct primary care are, quote, expenses for medical care under Section 213 of the Code, because these payments are for medical care. A health reimbursement arrangement provided by an employer generally may reimburse an employee for DPC arrangement payments. It's great. It works for businesses. But it stops short of saying the same thing for individuals. And the IRS still takes the position that DPC arrangements or insurance or some sort of health plan. So we have two separate treatments for a piece of, you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I totally see where you're going with it, and I think it's a really good question. It was not on my radar screen. It is now, and I want to get to the bottom of whether these things are insurance or not. I've started to have conversations. I understand there's a complication. I understand there's benefits to an interpretation that would not have it treated as insurance, and I want to get back to you on it.
I appreciate that. Secondly, we've had, my office has pushed, part of the reason for the backlog is that they have these services that kind of fill up your phone calls with automated services so that you have to go to them to get through.
Yes.
And you had a pilot program as to how to address that. How is the pilot program going, may I ask?
It worked, and part of it is that we were able to get the reporting time down to 4 minutes, or the waiting time down to 4 minutes.
Is that by taking out the automated calls?
It's part of that reason is
So is that pilot going to be expanded to the entirety of this? Because I was told it was a pilot. Has it now become?
Yeah, I don't know that I can say we're gonna continue to leverage that type of solution to make sure that we are preventing that practice, because that's not a fair practice.
Yeah, it seemed like
we had success, which is the bottom line, and you always want to replicate that success. So we're very interested in figuring out why it went right and how to scale it.
Sounds great. You're filing, the private sector is obviously filing returns for people, but do you perceive a conflict of interest where the IRS, which is going to tax people, is also helping them to fill out their forms? The interpretation which an independent filer may take on their behalf might then be taken in a different way?
Yeah, it's an important question. I think it's a policy question, actually. What I want to do is answer the question is what are the operational implications of a direct file program? The idea that the IRS would be more involved in tax preparation through a direct file. I mean, I think other countries do it. It's a debate. I don't want to weigh in on the debate. I want you and the Treasury Department and the President to decide, and then we'll figure out how to administer it.
Thank you for great answers. I yield.
I thank my colleague. I think he missed some of the earlier discussion, because I and Senator Crapo, Senator Warren, a number of senators have asked questions about free file. The history of this is pretty interesting. Down at the end of the dais on your side, Dan Coates was with me on a bipartisan free file proposal years ago. And of course, all of the powerful interests came out and said Western civilization was going to end. And we tried to simply say it would be voluntary. In other words, all parties agreed that if we go forward with such a thing for the people of Louisiana and Oregon and everywhere else, it will be an option. It will not be required in any way, shape, or form. So we look forward to having that discussion. I thank you. Senator Menendez.
Congratulations, Commissioner, on your confirmation. Over the last year, I led 8 letters to the IRS about a range of customer service issues impacting taxpayers. Just as the IRS expects taxpayers to file on time, taxpayers and tax professionals should be able to count on the IRS to answer the phone, respond to questions, and process refunds in a timely manner. And thanks to the resources provided by the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS has hired 5,000 new customer service workers to help meet taxpayer needs. It's now consistently answering the phones, as I understand it, between 80 and 90% of the time at an average speed of 4 minutes compared to last year when the average level of phone service was 17% with a speed of answer rate of 27 minutes. So that's good, but there's still more work to be done. Currently, it takes approximately 20 weeks to amend paper and electronic returns. Commissioner, can we expect a more acceptable timeline for the IRS to process amended returns?
You should expect it, and we should be held accountable for it. I mentioned earlier, we have the ability post-filing season to redirect some of our staff to the paper backlog versus being on the phones because the call volume should go down. That will enable us to process more. We are scanning more paper forms. The more we scan, the easier it is to get them processed. It makes the process more fluid. And then there are longer-term solutions, whether it's hiring more people to help process these paper and amended returns, or building technology solutions to more automate it, because right now in most cases we can't accept an amended return electronically. This is why the Inflation Reduction Act is not just about managing the day-to-day. It wasn't supposed to be about that. It's supposed to be about modernizing, and I'm hoping we can preserve those funds in the Inflation Reduction Act.
So with all of that, what can we get this down to, and in what time frame do you think that?
Well, as an example, I mentioned that on the employee retention credit, I mentioned to Senator Warner, we're trying to, we are at about resolving 20,000 a week right now, post-filing season. I'm asking the team to double that output and to focus on the oldest first, obviously, to make sure those that have been waiting the longest. But I appreciate the question. It is part of the challenges that we have in terms of this paper backlog, but we're making progress.
Correcting a small mistake shouldn't lead to a 5-month delay in receiving a refund. And so I'm proud of the progress you've made, but we need to do better. Let me ask you, with reference to a joint report from Stanford University and the Department of Treasury, found that black taxpayers are at least 3 times as likely to be audited by the Internal Revenue Service. The IRS doesn't collect data on race or ethnicity, and the report suggests that the disparity is attributed to discrimination in the IRS's computer algorithms that select returns for audit. The report also found that the IRS disproportionately audits people who claim the Earned Income Tax Credit. So, Commissioner, last time you were before this committee, you committed to providing a report on this issue within 60 days of your confirmation. That would be May 9th, so we're not there yet. I understand that. But with that commitment nearly 3 weeks away, what have you learned about the issue, and how is the IRS planning to address this inequity?
So I want to start with the important premise that it's essential that our tax system is fair. Fairness is what anchors our mission statement. And when I got the directive from this committee to issue a report in 60 days, I engaged with my team on day one to make sure it's a priority to fully understand what's going on with this report from Stanford and how do we get to the bottom of it and figure out what we need to do going ahead. I don't want to get ahead of the final report because it's not done yet. I will share that we are asking, I think, the right set of questions. We're asking questions like, what are the major tenets of IRS current corrective action plan to address improper payments? Do existing EITC case selection process unfairly raise audit rates for black taxpayers in relation to non-black taxpayers? There's about 6 or 7 key questions that we're answering.
Are you still committed to providing a written report to the committee by May 9th?
Absolutely.
Okay. And then finally, while we're on the topic of tax equity and tax administration, the IRS contracted with ID.me for verification services of this tax season, despite a track record of inequitable outcomes for minority taxpayers. When can we expect the IRS to use Logan.gov for verification services?
Yeah, and we are very interested in adding additional authenticating providers, and login.gov is one that we're interested in. It's my understanding that they are working through at GSA some security issues that they want to make sure that they've wrapped up. Once those security issues are wrapped up, we will move forward with login.gov as a
I'd like you to be able to give us a report when you see you're on your way to that.
Yep,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Menendez, and for coming down strongly on this matter of the racial disparities. It was so striking when we heard the original conversation. If they got that kind of information when they weren't looking for it, it just struck us that we better get on it, because if you're going to look for it, it could be significantly more serious. So thank you. Look forward to working with you. All right, Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Werfel, I appreciate the time we spent in the office. I was one of 4 of the members of this committee that voted for your confirmation, along with 2 others off the committee, because I think you bring a private sector experience, deep knowledge of the IRS. If I were confronted, if I were back in my job at Price Waterhouse Consulting with enterprise transformation, and I was assigned a client that was struggling to meet current service level agreements, trying to get customer service right, trying to get the technical people you need to fulfill the primary mission of the organization, the first thing that I would tell my client is don't think about a big new system that expands your responsibilities before we fix the current plumbing, which I believe you're well qualified to do. Why shouldn't I look at all the calls for free filing as one of those at-risk projects for enterprise transformation when 70% of the taxpayers are already eligible for free file? If my data is correct, anybody making less than $73,000 a year with a public-private partnership that the IRS has today with tax filing entities, they already have it. So even if you felt like you need to get to 100%, why wouldn't you figure out how to plus up that relationship versus build your own and compete with the private sector that's already fulfilling the need?
Well, Senator, it's an excellent question. And, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking, yeah, you absolutely have to keep the lights on. We have to be there to answer the calls. Yeah. We also have to concurrently build incremental improvements.
Yeah. And I get it. And you're gonna answer that question in a way that's going to satisfy me. So I'm going to stipulate that you're going to give me a good answer, because I want to move on. Yeah. So you're confirmed. Can you tell me whether or not you believe that the IRS has the authority, without new authorizing legislation and appropriations, to develop and implement a system for the service to prepare returns for taxpayers or allow them to directly file directly with the service using the government-run software? I know there's $15 million out there to study it, but
yeah. No, I've got this question earlier, and I think I committed to come back because the remit under the Inflation Reduction Act is for us to assess the feasibility. Most often we're doing that because
I suspect Congress you don't have, I hate cutting people off, but I want to stick to my time. I suspect that you don't have the appropriate authorizations and funding. And so now we're going to take our attention away from your core mission, which is to transform the IRS, and say, we also want you to focus on this other big project, which really doesn't have a lot to do with a lot of the KPIs you need to be working on now. So a last question related to this. Recognizing the well-documented leaks of taxpayer information and outdated computer technology, what's your assessment of the service's technical capabilities to develop a complicated program that would actually do that? Or do you view that as an implementation risk for all the other big rocks that you need to turn over now that you've been confirmed?
Well, I think I mentioned during my confirmation hearing, in many ways, it's got to begin and end with data security. It's fundamental. People have to know and trust that they're
and we have some credibility issues to deal with there.
There's mixed results. Like, I looked at it and I said, okay, tell us about our technology. Well, we successfully defend a billion cyber attacks a year. And we need to continue on that path, because one successful attack.
So let's harden the base that we're already the data stewards of. Prove that we can do that on a sustained basis, and then decide whether or not we want to dramatically increase that base that would be subject to the same vulnerabilities. I know that your training experience in the private sector put you in a position to say, you're asking me to move things ahead of the implementation timeline that are standing in the critical path of the things that I need to get done quickly. And I think Congress needs to hear that, to understand that we don't do alla prima when it's technology, cybersecurity, everything else. If we don't focus on the primary goals so the taxpayers can be more satisfied, so that your customer satisfaction ratings can go up, then we're going to lose. The last thing, and I'll submit a question for the record, but also on the tax gap.
Yes.
The left is going to say it's all about finding a handful of billionaires and trillionaires. If there is one, there will be one soon. And the right is going to say all you're doing is hurting small businesses with the tax gap. But we don't have the information to even know that. I've asked a simple question. Let's stratify all of the people that contribute to the tax gap so that we have a distributional analysis of where we need to go after it. And I can't get an answer to that question. So why is it that I can't get an answer when somebody says that we've got a $1 trillion tax gap, that I can't have, at least at the 30,000-foot level, what bucket they fit into? Because I think we're talking past the fundamental issue. If somebody owes tax, we could have a separate discussion about whether or not that tax should exist. But to the extent that it's in the tax code, then the taxpayers need to pay it, and then we can work on repealing it. But I really need more information at a more granular level than $1 trillion. Yep. So that I can start applying a rationality test to some of the statements that are coming out of these committee hearings and out of the mouths of my colleagues, because I don't think that they actually have the data upon which they can base some of these assertions. I'm gonna try and set up a meeting to come with you. Would you commit to me having a meeting in your office to go through your enterprise transformation plan?
Absolutely.
I look forward to it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
I thank my colleague, and just to give him a 30 seconds worth of history before you were on the committee. The reason that this tax gap issue was so relevant over the last year is because it wasn't some member of this committee, a Democrat or a Republican. It was Donald Trump's commissioner who held the post that Mr. Werfel did, Mr. Reddick. Chuck Reddick, who had been a longtime auditor, he was the one who made the statement, A, that he thought it could be up to $1 trillion, and B, it was his opinion that it was overwhelmingly due to those who are extremely wealthy because of the argument, and I certainly have made it, that for somebody who is a trucker, for example, in Oregon or North Carolina, the government actually has the information in the vast majority of cases. That's
Mr. Chair, which is why I find it extraordinary that I can't get an answer to my question. If people have made that assumption, then hopefully someone who made that statement actually had accurate data upon which to base that statement, and we don't have it. So whether it's the Trump administration, the Biden administration, Obama, Bush, Clinton, that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is I haven't seen anybody share that with me. So all we've got is $1 trillion number and a great political whipping boy. But I'm not here to do that. I'm here to solve the problem, even if it is applying a tax code that I disagree with. If you owe it, pay it. But let's get more strategic about the way we go about dealing with the tax. If we want to solve the problem, if we want to keep it at the high level and use it as a talking point in committee, that's great. But if we want to solve the problem, we have to have data to drive our priorities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I would only say my colleague is absolutely right in saying that it's smart to get more detail. And as you and I talked about, an example of a detail is our Credit Suisse investigation, where Credit Suisse got busted a decade ago, and our investigators found they're doing exactly the same thing. So we have hard information on it. So as you seek to get more detail on it, put me down and happy to work with you. Okay, Senator Barrasso.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Werfel, thanks very much for being here. When we visited in my office and when you were here for your nominating hearing, I asked you for your opinion on the funding priorities in this reckless tax and spending bill. I expressed my concern about $80 billion in additional funding for the IRS. And specifically, we talked about the enforcement amount versus the amount for taxpayer services. $45 billion for enforcement and only $3 billion for taxpayer services. So the ratio of $15 of enforcement for every $1 of services, in the IRS strategic operating plan for the spending of all of this money, the first objective that you list is to dramatically improve services to help taxpayers meet their obligations and receive the tax incentives for which they're eligible, yet the money ratio is 15 to 1 enforcement over providing for services. And this doesn't even include the additional $29 billion request for supplemental funding that you've come up with. So why would the IRS in its discretionary budget request, despite $45 billion in funding for enforcement, request, again, more money for enforcement, $5.9 billion, than it's requesting for taxpayer services, $3.4 billion?
Yeah, so I'm really appreciative of the question because I think it's really important to break down our budget in a way that makes sense and can be understood. So our base budget pays for our day-to-day operations, the volume of things that come in both from a services and an enforcement standpoint. And as I explained in my testimony, if you look at our base budget over the last 10 or 15 years, it has been on a steep decline, while the U.S. population and the tax laws and filers has all been much more complicated. So when COVID hit, everything kind of broke. And at that point, it was basically we couldn't do and continue to manage the way we would want, and services plummeted, and frankly, audit rates plummeted. And so what we need to do now is not think about the Inflation Reduction Act as let's use that to patch the holes in our base budget, because what the Inflation Reduction Act does is it spends for increased capacity so that we can improve operations. The difference, Senator, between just answering the calls versus having a callback option, having more digital channels, having more bots in the phone line so that people can get through quicker on things they can do in an automated way. So now to your question, look, there is room for us to increase our capacity in enforcement. The stats on this are pretty eye-opening. We only have today 2,600 staff that are responsible for assessing compliance with our highest wealth taxpayers, and there's more than 390,000 high wealth taxpayers. So to give you a ratio, that's one IRS person for every 150 high wealth taxpayer. And these filings are big and complicated. They can be thousands of pages, tens of thousands of pages long. So look, if we started to move money out of enforcement into services, we would lose the ability to develop the capacity in that area, and that ratio would suffer. So the reality is we need to do both. It's our job and our role to make sure that the tax system is operating effectively, answering the calls, improving the calls, but also making sure people pay what they owe.
Because as we discussed, what I hear about in Wyoming are people that call the IRS, trying to get information, can't get somebody to answer the phone, all of those issues. So, sticking to the issue of taxpayer service, when you look at the justification that you printed for this fiscal year budget, it says, quote, unless the IRS realizes sustained increases in discretionary funding, service quality is going to continue to suffer. I still don't know why the IRS is, in its plea for more money in its budget request, threatening to cut back taxpayer services instead of wanting more and more money for enforcement. So that's where I am on that. The other issue is this long-awaited strategic plan for the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. It's well documented, very late, despite the extra time to pull together this highly anticipated plan. It's lacking in measurable targets. Basically, to summarize, the indicator said, we will do better. So the Wall Street Journal reported that your Deputy Treasury Secretary, Wally Odiamo, referred to the plan, and he says, we don't want to be locked into numbers on a piece of paper. I would just tell you, Mr. Werfel, every taxpayer in this country believes that they are locked into numbers on a piece of paper or they can go to jail. That is the difference. But if your assistant deputy secretary doesn't think you don't want to be locked into numbers on a piece of paper, I have taxpayers all around Wyoming who have very similar concerns. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank my colleague, Senator Casey.
Mr. Chairman, thanks very much. Commissioner, good to be with you. I wanted to start with a program that is little known and probably underappreciated, but is enjoying, I think, great success. And it's not a program that many people have heard about, so-called VITA, V-I-T-A, Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. I was just up in, not far from where I live in northeastern Pennsylvania, up in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, the Pocono Mountains, and I met with a group of volunteers who work as part of VITA, and we know that last year, VITA helped nearly 2 million Americans do their taxes and claim tax refunds for free. VITA tax returns are very, very accurate. Its volunteers have a 96% accuracy rate in preparing returns, while paid preparers have only a 40% accuracy rate, according to a GAO study in 2014. So 96% accuracy rate versus 40 for paid preparers. And also, you get a great bang for our taxpayer buck. The IRS spends about only $21 per return prepared through VITA, and 10 times that much, about $220 per return through a tax preparer. So it's clear that VITA is a great deal for taxpayers, and we're getting good results from it. It saves taxpayers time and money in penalty fees, and it saves the IRS time in correcting incorrect returns. However, the IRS was not specific about its plans for the VITA program in the strategic plan. What does the IRS plan to use the infusion of funds from the Inflation Reduction Act to improve the volunteer taxpayer services in VITA?
Thank you for the question, Senator. And I agree with you. It's a critically important and successful program. And I was pleased to see that the number of VITA prepared returns increased. It was 1.8 million last tax season. It's over 2 million this year. So it's nice to see the program expanding. Part of what we are doing in the IRS is working more towards engaging these types of programs and stakeholders to meet taxpayers where they are, better understanding how we can lend that helping hand to taxpayers, how they need it. Do they need more digital channels? Do they need more help from trusted partners like VITA? It absolutely has to be an area of investment, and I can provide you with more details in terms of how we might scale and continue to invest in that program, but it absolutely is, I'm a personal champion of that program, and we'll continue to work with them.
No, I appreciate that, and I want to salute you and your team on the great success you've had in providing better taxpayer services here. The numbers are very compelling and irrefutable about better service and the investment that we made. Another area I wanted to ask you about was the bonus tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act that reward companies that are either building new energy projects in coal communities. That's a provision that I worked on and pushed forward, or companies who use American manufactured products. So we don't want to just improve supply chains generally. We don't want to simply create the clean energy future, which we have to create, but we want to make sure that we can have the elements of those energy products, the content of them, made in America.
Yep.
We know that last year we gained almost 800,000 manufacturing jobs, or I should say over the 2 years, and we want to build on that. So we need strong domestic content rules to reward companies for building their energy components in America. Not good enough to have a clean energy future if it's all going to be built by some other country, for example, like China. However, the IRS and Treasury have not released guidance on how companies can claim these bonus credits for domestic content. So I'd ask you, can you commit to working with me to release a strong and clear domestic content set of rules very soon?
Yes, absolutely. We have, I talked to the team. They are working on that very guidance document along with others that are coming up in the next few months related to the energy provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act. So the answer is yes, Senator.
Commissioner, thanks very much. I'll send a question or two for the record, but thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner, we're waiting for a moment for Senator Cantwell. I do want to take up just for a minute as we wait this last point with respect to these communities that he's speaking of. In designing the clean energy tax credits, and this was something I was involved in for a full decade since Joe Manchin asked me to come to West Virginia. We said we were going to come up with a tax code that was technology neutral, so as to be market-oriented, and be a system that would reward those out there who would reduce carbon emissions. We had a number of senators in this committee and elsewhere saying, I want to be part of the future. I want to be part of something better. But we've got to make sure that we have tangible concrete tools out there for communities that are serious about being part of the future and want to know how you can actually get it done. Senator Casey, with the effort, and I believe sometimes we called it the incentives program, sometimes we called it the bonus, tax credit provision. We said very bluntly that these communities had to have an opportunity to be part of the future that Senator Casey and Senator Brown and others envisioned. So I want you to know, Senator Casey, we're going to be with you every step of the way until all of this is fully implemented. As we know, we've made progress on the other side of the coin, the energy communities, but you just keep raising it. I'm going to be pushing for you every step of the way. Okay. Senator Cantwell has joined us, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. This important hearing, particularly at this time. Last week, the IRS announced that nearly 1.5 million Americans have unclaimed tax refunds from 2019. In Washington State, the pandemic and other disruptions prevented as many as 42,000 people from filing their 2019 tax return, leaving a total of 44 million in unclaimed refunds. When you were here last February, the IRS, you said that the IRS should be able to communicate in a much more timely and aggressive fashion for taxpayers, and I agreed with that. In April 12th, the unclaimed refunds, you stated, frequently see students, part-time workers, and others with little time to really realize this. So what, I know that to ensure these individuals have the money they owe, they need to be ahead of the July 17th deadline. So what is the IRS doing to create greater public awareness for these unclaimed refunds, and do you have plans to reach out to individuals to ensure they file before the July deadline?
Yeah, and I was pleased with the type of publicity that was created when we announced the July deadline. A lot of media outlets covered it, and basically said, look, the IRS is informing you that you are eligible for a refund, and you should come because we are wanting people that are eligible, whether for it's a credit or a refund, to claim it. Now, how do we continue to build on that outreach? There's got to be more than we can do than just issuing a press release. We can use social media. We can engage with intermediaries and associations and groups. And this is part of, the vision that we have for improved customer service is not just, hey, we're here, we're going to answer your call. That's part of it, and that's critical. But it's also outreach to meet taxpayers where they are. And so it's two-way. It's us here when you need us, whether it's in an assistance center, a walk-in center, or the call, but also we want to meet you where you are to help small businesses meet their obligations.
Sorry, sir.
That's okay.
How many taxpayers do you estimate are missing or receiving the earned income tax credit because they failed to file in 2019, overall, besides our state?
I don't think we have an exact number, but I think we believe it's over 1 million people that could be claiming refunds that aren't, but I could try to get you a more precise number.
Yeah, I think just given the numbers in our state, I would think that would easily make 1 million. Well, I think we communicated also about this notion that, when it comes to owing money to the IRS, we have a lot of direct communication with people. Yeah. So I'm for creating a more virtual experience for taxpayers, particularly by segmentation, when these are the problems, these are the issues, right? I know you have frequently asked questions and things of that nature, but I think the response from the IRS and direct communication with people on these issues would go a long way.
I appreciate that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. We're going to liberate you momentarily, Commissioner. I just want to give you my sense of where we are. I mean, the reason the tax gap is so important, and I started talking about it, it's come up, repeatedly, is my take, looking at all the data we have and what Chuck Rettig and others have said, is closing the tax gap cannot really be addressed unless you also beef up enforcement against those very wealthy individuals who aren't paying taxes. Second, I think you've made the case with respect to improving customer service, and I think you've done it in an appropriate way. You haven't stood up and shouted, "We're done, we're done." You said, "Look, we're making a lot of progress here. It's high time that we did in terms of the calls and shorter waiting times and reducing the backlog." And I like the fact that we've made it clear we got a lot of heavy lifting to do. Nobody is having a victory parade today. Your comments with respect to auditing of taxpayers, again, with incomes below $400,000, we're going to clearly make progress compared to what we saw a few years ago, and I think that is an important objective as well. With the release of the strategic operating plan, we've got a opportunity to really do this right in terms of making sure we protect people who shouldn't be subjected to audits, and at the same time going after the high income individuals and corporations and partnerships. One last point that I think I've kind of touched on is when I look at this question of the high flyers and people who have repeatedly skirted the law, I am especially focused on the IRS going after repeat tax evaders. What people asked me when they heard about Credit Suisse, they said, "Ron, you're kidding me. I read that they got busted just a few years ago and their CEO came in and raised their hand and said, never going to happen again." You can't explain to taxpayers how you're not doing anything about it if it happens again, and we actually gave them a discount on their penalties the first time because they made all these claims that, we'll be honest. So how you deal with these repeat tax evaders is particularly important to me. I want to close with three quick points. Tomorrow, the finance members will have a briefing by the Commissioner, Commissioner Werfel, on the strategic operating plan. We thank you. Give the opportunity for members to ask additional questions. I and Senator Menendez both asked you today about this question of these racially biased audits. Very, very troubling. And from the very first day, I asked about whether it'd be on time, and for a repeat response, you said, "You bet it'll be on time," which is going to be something members pay attention to because you're following through. With respect to that, we'll follow through and say for the information of members, questions for the record are going to be due by 5 p.m. next Wednesday. That's April 26th.
Mr. Chairman, before you gavel close,
Yeah.
I just wanted one procedural point, which is I mentioned to both you and Senator Crapo that after the plan was issued, we've got questions from Congress, both authorizers and appropriators, with questions about numbers, and we've been providing information. And as a result of providing that information, there's now available to you 10-year spend numbers over the life of the IRA, more detailed FTE numbers over a 3-year window. But I realize that as we provide that information, it's not simple for you to know where it is. So we put together a compendium of that. I'd like to introduce that for the record so that you have a one-stop shop for it and the public can see it as well.
Without objection, the welcome news that there will be a one-stop shop is introduced in the record at this point. We look forward tomorrow as well. And again, I just want to thank you for saying you're going to be hands-on and you're going to follow through. That's what the job's all about, and you're saying that's your focus. With that, we're adjourned.